girl, though, then brushed me off. Said the prayer vigil went so well he's going to host a revival. Maybe I'll drop by. He might get to talk to his mother while there. He ended the call and found Beth by the car, leaning against it and looking shaken. "What happened?" he asked as he approached. She chewed her bottom lip. "I don't know. I'm not usually squeamish about blood, but I've been having flashbacks of the unsub taking Sonny's blood, and I felt dizzy." Ian's pulse kicked up a notch. "You saw his face?" Frustration lined her brow. "No, just a hand holding a knife and then blood dripping down Sonny's arm." "I'm sorry, Beth." He stepped toward her. He wanted to pull her in his arms and wipe away the anguish in her eyes, but she warned him off with a hand and climbed in the car. Ian silently cursed, then slid in and started the engine. "You okay?" he asked. She gave a quick nod, although they both knew she was lying. Beth was so cold she rubbed at her arms. For the love of God, where had the unsub taken Prissy? Ian drove through a drive-in fast food place and ordered them both coffee. She accepted the cup with a murmured thanks, not trusting her voice to talk as he drove to the morgue for the task force meeting. When they arrived, Corbin Michaels was waiting on the steps to the hospital. He shoved a microphone at Beth. "Agent Fields, has the Boneyard Killer contacted you?" Beth paled and Ian shoved the mic away. "You mean since you exposed her real identity?" "I'm just doing my job," Michaels said. "You put Agent Fields in danger," Ian said. Beth held up a hand to silence the men. "Mr. Michaels, the only statement I wish to make is to warn the young girls in town to be careful. They should be cautious, travel in pairs, and not accept rides from strangers." She gave him a cold look. "Now we have work to do, so move out of the way." Ian took her arm and they rushed past Michaels into the hospital and to the task force meeting room. The others were waiting. Dr. Wieland, Peyton, Weller from Search and Rescue, and Ian's two deputies. Beth handed the diary page to Peyton and explained that the unsub had left it for her. "Please be discreet with this," Beth said. "It's personal. I don't want the contents to be leaked, especially to that reporter." Although she'd reread it a dozen times, it had only stirred memories of being lonely and scared. Nothing helpful. No mention that she'd noticed someone watching her or that any strangers had been to the Otter's house. "I understand," Peyton said softly. "Don't worry. Corbin Michaels won't get any information from me. Maybe the unsub left some DNA on one of the pages. Let's hope so. Did CSU find anything at my cabin?" Peyton gave her a sympathetic smile. "I'm afraid not." Director Vance made a beeline for Beth. She braced herself for a butt-chewing. "I thought I told you to go back to Knoxville, Beth. I don't want this guy getting to you." Ian moved up beside her. "Don't worry, I'll stick with her 24/7. The director slanted him a wary look. "Why does that not make me feel any better?" "Please," Beth said. "I can't leave now. My memories are finally returning." Director Vance jammed his hands into the pockets of his suit jacket. "Then lie low. Let us run things and I'll keep you posted." Beth reluctantly nodded, although she had no intention of lying low. Prissy needed her. Ian sensed Vance's censure from his body language. Beth would never tuck her tail and run. The best he could do was to protect her. Director Vance called the group to order. "We need updates from everyone. And let's establish a timeline with the identities of the Vics, where they disappeared from, and any evidence we've collected to date." Peyton tacked photographs of the victims on the magnetic whiteboard and wrote their names below along with dates of their births and hometowns. Ian studied the names, dates of disappearances, and cities where they went missing. Billy Lynn Hanover disappeared 18 years ago from Macon, Georgia. Sonny Smith and J.J. disappeared 15 years ago from Sweetwater, Tennessee. Haley Pranston disappeared 12 years ago from Ringgold, Georgia. Doris Wyan disappeared 11 years ago from Calhoun, Georgia. Drina Cutlet disappeared 10 years ago from Dalton, Georgia. Retha Allen disappeared 4 years ago from Lexington, Kentucky. Hillary Trenton disappeared 3 years ago from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Lindy Saxton Disappeared 3 weeks ago from Cleveland, Tennessee. A mountain of relief filled Ian. God. He'd waited so long to prove his father had been wrongfully convicted. Those dates were definitive proof of his father's innocence. He needed to find him and tell him. Where the hell was he? He had to know that Ian was investigating these murders and that Beth was here. Why hadn't his father contacted him? All the victims were between the ages of 12 and 15, Whelan said. All were either from troubled homes, in foster care, or runaways. Agent Hamrick and Agent Coulter are trying to track down family, teachers, anyone who knew them. Whelan took a breath. We believe that Haley, Drina, and Doris were abducted during the time Coach Gleason was incarcerated. Ian nodded. That means my father wasn't the killer. Gleason went to prison for nothing, Beth murmured. And the man who took me and murdered these girls has been out there all along, hunting. That's the way it looks, Beth. Now let's focus on the information we have, Director Vance said. Peyton used pushpins on the wall map to identify the cities the victims had disappeared from. Beth stood, walked over to the map, and drew a line connecting the cities. Although the victims are from different cities and states, they're all from the southeast. Each city runs along I-75. Ian zeroed in on the route along I-75. The expressway ran through several states, providing a big hunting ground for the unsub. So why had he buried them in Graveyard Falls instead of dumping them in random places along the way? What was his connection to this town? Beth stared in horror as the faces of the dead girls burst to life in her mind. All so young and full of life, so vulnerable, so lost, so in need of love. But they'd ended up being murdered by some sadistic monster. Not Coach Gleason, though. Tears of guilt and sorrow burned her throat. That poor man had gone to jail for a crime he hadn't committed. He'd tried to help the teens at school. Instead, he'd suffered and lost his family because of his efforts. Peyton placed a sketch of another girl on the board. Our forensic artist used the bones to sketch out an approximation of what this Jane Doe looked like. This is only a likeness, but our artist is pretty good and— Peyton's words faded as the girl's face materialized in Beth's mind. Wavy, sandy brown hair to her shoulders, big, sad green eyes. Then her voice. I'm sorry. Beth hadn't understood then. She understood now. The girl had been forced to ride with him. He'd used her to lure Beth and Sonny inside the cab. The girl was May. A strangled sob caught in her throat, and she stood, trembling as the memory rushed back. The sound of May screaming for her life. A wave of nausea rolled through Beth, and she clutched her stomach and ran from the room. The door slamming echoed in her head, as did Ian shouting her name. She didn't stop. She was sweating and shaking as she darted into the ladies' room. A second later, she collapsed on her knees in the stall and doubled over. A cry ripped from her gut and sounded like a wild animal as she lost her coffee and the food she'd had earlier. The face of another girl surfaced. Her name was Willa. Willa had been dead when they'd arrived. May had admitted she'd been forced to watch Willa die, 3 days after he'd abducted May. When she first ran away, May had lived on the streets. She'd eaten garbage and turned tricks to survive. One man had gotten rough with her and she'd run. That night she'd been scared and climbed into the truck with the unsub. He'd given her a bottle of water. That was all she remembered until she'd woken up in the cave, the place where they all eventually died. Chapter 20. Ian shifted, anxious to go after Beth. Dr. Whelan pushed his glasses on top of his head. What just happened? Do you want me to check on her? Peyton asked. Ian gave a slight shake of his head. Let's take a break. She'll probably be back by then. Everyone gathered to get coffee and water. Ian stepped from the room and crossed the hall to the bathroom. He paused and listened. It was quiet, so he knocked gently. Beth? No answer. Beth, it's me, Ian. He eased open the door just a crack. Are you in here? A sniffled echo from inside the stall. Ian glanced down at the opening and recognized Beth's black flats. Worry knotted his belly. "Are you okay?" A heartbeat passed, then shuffling. "Yes. I'll be there in a minute." He held the door open, hating to intrude but wanting to help. "Is there anything I can do?" "No. Just give me a minute." Another sniffle. "Please." Ian couldn't stand to think of her alone. She'd already suffered so much. He slipped inside the bathroom and shut the door. "I'm worried about you. What happened?" Beth's shoes clicked to the floor as she stood, then eased open the door. "I'm sorry. I just remembered the cave again. May is the name of the girl in the sketch. She was in the truck when Sonny and I were picked up." "She's the reason you thought it was safe to accept the ride?" Ian said. Beth nodded. "There was another girl named Willa that May told me about. She was dead when we got there. He made May watch him kill Willa. There were others before her. I felt bones on the floor of the cave." "You said she disappeared a couple of weeks before you left the Otters," Ian said. "How long was she with him?" "Just a few days. She'd been sleeping on street corners before he picked her up. According to her, he had a pattern. He kept a girl until he found a new one. Then he made the new girl watch the other one die." "He did it to frighten her into submission," Ian said. Beth nodded. "May knew what he was going to do to her, to all of us. That's why she told me she was sorry when they picked me up." Ian released a weary sigh. "How awful, Beth. No wonder you repressed those memories." A low sob escaped her. "I should have faced them. Then I could have saved these other girls." Ian soothed her with soft words. "Don't do that, Beth. You were a kid. No one should have suffered what you went through." The turmoil in her eyes ripped at his gut. "Maybe your boss is right. You should leave town, and I'll let you know when we catch this bastard." "No." She pushed a strand of her tangled hair from her face. It had come loose from the bun and hung in disarray. She was beautiful, vulnerable and hurting, but so amazing it nearly robbed his breath. He wanted to change the world for her, show her sunshine and roses and happy places. The only way to do that was to find the madman who'd hurt her. Slowly he rubbed her arms. Her face was milky white. "I promise you I'll find him." Beth squeezed her eyes closed, and he drew her against him. Her body trembled in his arms, and he comforted her with tender strokes, brushing her tear-soaked hair away from her neck. "I see him everywhere," she whispered against his chest. "I'm sure I'm just paranoid, but I feel like he's watching me." He probably was. He'd been in her place. "He won't hurt you," Ian promised. She rested her head against him for a moment. "I have to remember his face. It's the only way we can stop him." "We can stop him with good police work," Ian said firmly. "No, I have to remember. Pieces are starting to come back." A knock sounded and they both startled. "Everything all right in there?" Peyton called. Beth pulled away. "Yes, I'll be right out." Ian stepped back to give her some space, but he missed the physical contact. "I mean it, Beth. You don't have to keep working this case." She straightened and walked to the sink, then turned on the water. "I've run from him long enough. If I don't confront him and put him away, I'll always be looking over my shoulder." She offered him a determined smile. "I won't live like that any longer." As soon as Ian left the restroom, Beth looked in the mirror. She hardly recognized herself. Her skin was colorless, her eyes red and puffy, her hair in a tangled mess. She quickly smoothed the strands back in place and secured them at the nape of her neck. Her compact was in the meeting room, so she couldn't do anything about her face. Embarrassment heated her skin, adding some color to her ghostly pallor. No one in that room cared what she looked like. They were here to solve a case, and she just remembered something that might potentially be helpful. She took a deep breath and exited the bathroom. Ian stood just inside the conference room door while the others were settling back into their seats. Ian pushed a cup of coffee into her hand. "Beth?" "I'll be fine," she said, her tone more curt than she intended. God, she was a mess. But being in his arms had felt too good. She wanted to be back there where she felt safe. He studied her for a moment, making her skin prickle with unease. Their connection went back years. He understood her more than anyone else. She sipped the coffee, grateful for the punch of caffeine, then forced herself to rejoin the others. A hushed quiet fell over the room. Beth ignored the curious looks and slipped into a chair. "I'm sorry I interrupted the meeting, but I remembered something. The girl in the artist's sketch is May. She lived with my foster parents and ran away." Beth swallowed hard. "The unsub found her and used her to lure me and Sonny into his truck that night. Then he forced us to watch him kill her, just as he'd forced her to watch another girl named Willa die." Hope whispered through the room. She knew they were counting on her, and she hated to let them down. "Do you know Willa's last name?" Peyton asked. Beth shook her head. "No, I'm sorry." Peyton turned to her computer. "I'll see if I can find her." Beth mentally envisioned the killer's hand as he raised that sharp knife and sliced May's wrist. Did he have a tattoo? Any distinguishing marks? Candlelight flickered. He murmured something about saving her, not to be afraid of the dark or death, that the candle would light the way. "I've been putting together a profile," she continued. "Because of the number of kills, it seems like he's sadistic. But the religious undertones, the way he leaves the girls with a candle so they're not afraid, and the cross indicates that he cares about them." She hesitated. "The fact that there is no sexual component also implies that he isn't trying to inflict pain, and that he's not a violent person." "How can you say he's not violent?" Deputy Markham asked. "It's his pathology. He's not in a rage when he kills the girls. He doesn't torture or beat them or inflict unnecessary pain. Although he cuts their wrists, he does it quickly instead of toying with them. Then he sits with them while they pass." "You know all that from a profile?" Deputy Markham asked. Beth gave him a flat look. "I was there when May died." "What else did you see?" Ian asked. "The candles glowing. They're part of his ritual, like a ceremony." She tried to piece together more details. "He baptizes the girls in a pool of water, then recites a Bible verse. He comforts them and tells them not to be afraid of death." She paused, in his mindset now. "He believes he's saving the girls and sending them to a better place." Ian's fingers dug into his thighs as he listened. The details Beth remembered should be helpful, except they needed a description of the man. "Sonny begged him to let her go," Beth said, her voice laced with the pain of the memory. "I begged him to stop, but it was like he didn't hear me." "He could be under the influence of drugs," Deputy Whitehorse suggested. "Or he's psychotic," Dr. Whelan said. Peyton gestured to her computer. "According to the interviews Agent Hamrick and Agent Coulter conducted with the families of those victims we've ID'd so far, the girls all came from troubled homes." "We've already established that the victims were troubled kids or runaways," Ian said. "Yes, but each one mentioned seeking help, spiritual guidance." Peyton held up a finger to make a point. "Retha Allen and Hillary Trenton attended a revival hosted by a traveling preacher." Ian's pulse jumped. "A traveling preacher?" "Yes, a man named Reverend Wally Benton." Beth sighed. "My foster father took Sonny and me to several revivals during the time we lived with him. He and Reverend Benton were friends. Benton was old-school primitive Southern Baptist, a snake handler." Beth rubbed her temple. "But he wouldn't fit the age range of our killer at this point." Peyton looked up from her laptop. "Wally Benton died." "He has a son," Ian finished. "He's the reverend in charge of the Holy Waters Church, and his age fits the profile of the killer." Beth shuddered as she recalled the sermons Reverend Wally Benton had forced on the people who attended his revivals. If he was dead, he couldn't be their current unsub. She faintly remembered his son. He was a teenager when she was abducted. Could he have started his killing spree back then? The sound of computer keys tapping echoed through the room. Seconds later, Peyton spoke.
The son, Reverend Jim Benton, is speaking in a small town not too far from here tonight and tomorrow.
We'll talk to him, Beth said. Dr. Whelan stood. There's one more thing we should discuss. The ME tacked another sketch on the board. This is one of the Jane Does we haven't identified yet. She was killed approximately 30 years ago. Beth gasped softly. 30 years ago. Maybe she had the unsub's age wrong in the profile.
If this girl was actually his first kill, identifying her is imperative, Beth said. A serial killer's first kill is usually personal.
There's another problem, Ian said. If we're dealing with the same unsub, why did he wait so many years in between victims? Uneasy murmurs rumbled through the room.
He could have been satisfied with the first kill, possibly remorseful, Beth said. Maybe he married and had a normal life. Then years later something happened to trigger his need to kill again. He also could have been incarcerated or in a mental facility,
Peyton suggested.
I'll explore that angle.
Ian nodded in agreement. There's another possibility. He could have killed others during that time lapse and buried them somewhere else. Beth's chest clenched. She had felt more bones on the floor of the cave. Good God! Were the bones still there? Or was there another graveyard they hadn't yet uncovered? Chapter 21. Beth studied the blank space on the board where there should be a list of suspects. They'd eliminated Ian's father. Focusing on the Bentons had only stirred more questions and improbabilities.
Anything on Gail Carson's husband? Beth asked.
He had an alibi the night she went missing, Deputy Whitehorse said.
As long as we're speculating, we should consider the possibility that we're dealing with more than one killer, Beth said.
Director Vance angled his head toward Ian. If that's so, the partner could have killed while your father was in prison. That's ludicrous, Ian snapped. For one thing, my father was not a religious fanatic. We attended church, but he wasn't the type to lecture or preach. Another tense silence. Everyone fidgeted and seemed just as frustrated as Beth. Herman Otter's face materialized from the bowels of hell to make her draw a sharp breath. He had been a religious fanatic, had prayed every night and lit candles on holidays and talked about sin and salvation, then forced May into his bed. Except for the sexual aspect, he fit the profile. But he was dead. He'd been friends with Reverend Wally Benton, though.
I'll question Jim Benton, Beth said. He might know something helpful.
I told you to sit this out, Beth, Director Vance said. Hamrick can canvass the church members. Director Vance continued without missing a beat. Peyton, keep digging for connections between the victims. Dr. Whelan, see if you can get a solid ID on the body that has been dead 30 years. Agent Fields has a point. That victim might be the key to this mess. Beth bit her tongue. The elder Reverend Benton had been in his mid-30s to 40s when Otter had taken her to see him, which meant that if he'd killed victim number 1 30 years ago, he would have been a child or in his early teens at the time, unless he hadn't done it by himself. Now that the elder Benton was dead, his son Jim might be following in his father's footsteps. Beth stood, anxious to leave. To hell with protocol and sitting this thing out. She wanted to confront Reverend Jim Benton herself. His father had terrified her as a child. She wouldn't give anyone that kind of power now. Ian started to follow Beth, but her boss caught his arm before he could leave the room. I gave Beth orders. Make sure she follows them. Why do you think she'll listen to me? Ian asked. The director rubbed at his neck. I don't know, but she seems connected to you because of your past. I don't want her hurt again. They locked gazes. The man really cared about Beth in a fatherly kind of way. Don't worry. I'll make sure she's safe. A silent understanding passed between them. They each would do whatever was necessary to protect her. As Ian left the room, Beth was racing out the door. He hurried to catch up with her. I'll drive you back to the cabin.
I'm not going to the cabin, Beth said. I'm going to see Reverend Jim Benton.
But
I don't care what Vance said.
Beth dashed down the steps, the wind tossing her hair around her face.
I didn't come this far to walk away now.
Ian glanced back at the steps where the director and others were dispersing and made a snap decision. Beth was not in this alone. He wanted to talk to the man as much as she did. One of his own was missing. "All right," he said. "I'm in the mood for a sermon tonight." Beth almost cracked a grin, and Ian's chest squeezed. What would it be like to see that tortured woman smile? They walked to the car in silence. As Ian drove toward the revival, he passed through the town square. The Arts and Crafts Festival to raise money for those affected by the tornado was in full swing. The sidewalks were crowded, booths lined the streets and filled the park area, and vendors and food trucks had joined in. He grunted. Hard to believe that in the midst of the problems the people in this town are facing because of the damage from the storm, they have to worry about another killer preying on them at their most vulnerable time. Beth sighed. True, but the human spirit is resilient. Just look at the crowd that's turned out for this festival to support each other. You're right. Coco said an artist who lives in the mountains is donating proceeds from his sales to the town. They passed several booths selling everything from homemade soaps to spices and herbs to handmade quilts. Someone had tacked posters with a photo of Prissy on street posts asking for help in finding her. The revival tent was set up on the other side of the park. Ian parked and they climbed out and walked across the lawn. A sign was posted near the tent announcing sermons at dawn, noon, dusk, and 8 o'clock, with a special praise singing at midnight. The preacher's voice boomed toward them as they approached. He was lecturing about sin and salvation, sinners and saints, citing Bible verses and pounding his Bible as he paced back and forth on the stage. You may be lost today, asking yourself, where is God in all the horror that's come to this town of yours? But fear not, you are not alone, he shouted. If you are that lost person, struggling to find your way, all you have to do is turn to the Lord and ask for his help. He pounded his hand on the Bible. Take that step, and he will lead you into the light. He looks like his father, Beth said in a strained voice. Did you meet him when you came with the otters? Ian asked. Beth wrinkled her nose in thought. Yes. He handed out prayer cards and pamphlets listing his father's speaking schedule. Ian recognized several locals. Bud from the hardware store, Sarah Levinson, Myrtle from the supermarket, who always cracked jokes when he bought groceries, Abram Kane from the blood bank. He scanned the group in search of Bernie and his mother, but he didn't see them. Coco and her granddaughter Vanessa slowly walked up the aisle. Reverend Benton murmured something to her, then placed a hand on Vanessa's head. These people are in need of God's love, the Reverend said. Ian shifted uncomfortably as Benton launched into a prayer. Something about the predatory way Benton looked at Vanessa made Ian's senses come alert. This man had snowed his mother and dozens of others into following him. He was charismatic, charming, like the serpent that tricked Eve in the Bible. Beth's heart ached for Vanessa. She was just a teenager, but she looked as if she'd been beaten up by life. She's lucky to have her grandparents, Beth said. Yeah, she is. Coco is the heart of the community. If anyone needs anything, she's there, donating her time and food and love. Admiration for the woman stirred in Beth. The preacher said another prayer over Vanessa and Coco. Then the group burst into a gospel tune and began clapping. People waved their hands to the music. A woman hurried down the aisle and dropped to her knees in front of the makeshift altar, bowed her head and prayed. Moved by Benton, others joined her. There are some here who want to be saved, and others in need of recommitting their lives to the Lord, Benton said. This Sunday we'll host an old-fashioned baptismal at the river. Beth waited for the snake handling like the service Otter had taken her to, but she didn't see any sign of snakes. Instead, Benton's son relied on his strong voice, which boomed louder and louder as he ranted about sin and temptation. He slapped the Bible with his hand, then mopped sweat from his face as he gained steam. He strolled down the aisles of the tent, searching and seeking faces, bellowing for the lost ones to testify in front of the crowd. Religion had its place, and Beth believed in God and prayer. For some reason, he had saved her that awful day. But she didn't believe in terrorizing people with shouts about burning in hell for eternity. Finally, the revival wound down, and the crowd began to disperse. Some of the people were so emotional, crying and shouting that he'd moved them, that they promised to fight sin. Vanessa and Coco wandered through the crowd, Coco pausing to speak to everyone she passed. Beth and Ian stopped to talk to the Reverend. "We're investigating the Boneyard murders," Beth said. If he'd read the news, he most likely knew her real identity, and that she'd repressed memories of her abduction. But he simply smiled at her. "Yes, of course. Everyone in the community is upset about them." Ian cleared his throat. "We're looking for information on anyone who may have known the victims or come in contact with them." Reverend Benton tugged at his robe. "I'm afraid I didn't know any of the girls personally." "You didn't meet one of them at a revival?" Ian asked. "Not that I recall." He gestured toward the crowd. "Mind you, that doesn't mean they didn't attend one of my sermons. As you can see, I don't always get to speak to everyone present." Beth swallowed hard. "I assume you know who I am." His gaze scrutinized her. "I do, but only because of the news. I'm sorry for the ordeal you suffered when you were a young girl. How are you doing?" Beth's vision blurred. A gospel song about telling it on the mountain played in her head. Herman Otter's hand pushing her forward, pressing hard against her back. His wife Frances singing the praises as she aimed an ugly look at Beth, as if it was her fault that Herman liked young girls. Then the preacher's voice, his face. Beth blinked back into focus just as Ian spoke. "Your father was a preacher, and you followed in his footsteps." "Yes. He taught me to be a God-fearing man. When he passed, I decided to continue his work by spreading the word." Memories of the revivals Beth had attended flashed back. Wally Benton had been taller than his son, wider jaw, deep-set gray eyes, scar above his right eye. Herman Otter had taken her and Sonny to his revival service the night before they'd run away. After the preaching ended, while the Otters were lingering to talk to other followers, she'd snuck away and peeked in one of the tents. A teenager had been restrained, her body jerking with her screams. Reverend Benton was performing an exorcism. Bile rose to her throat, and her hand shook. "Beth?" Ian said softly. She thought she nodded, but she wasn't sure. Her stomach churning, she excused herself. "I'm sorry. I don't feel well." The sound of voices and laughter reverberated around her as she turned and ran. The world blurred and spun, a wave of nausea almost bringing her to her knees. She reached out, clawing for something to hold on to. So dizzy, her legs felt like rubber bands. A few feet away, she spotted a wooden building, a ladies' room. She could make it there. She had to before she passed out. Another dark wave. The sun moved. The sound of a baby crying. Someone playing a harmonica. She stumbled forward and reached for the door to the ladies' room, but someone grabbed her from behind and yanked her against the wall. Then the sharp blade of a knife jabbed her throat. Chapter 22. Cold fear immobilized Beth. She went stone still, debating her strategy. Fight him now or look for an opportune moment. Although if he tried to get her in a car, she would fight. A woodsy scent hit her, a man's rough beard stubble brushing her cheek as he pressed his mouth to her ear. "I know who you are," he murmured. Beth inhaled sharply. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Just be quiet and do as I say." He tightened his grip, the knife only a fraction of an inch from her neck. If she moved too quickly, he'd slice her carotid artery. "Just tell me what you want. Take my wallet."
"This is not about money."
He jerked her backward into the shadows of the awning.
"Don't you remember me?"
Beth's heart pounded as a memory from long ago stirred. The voice, deep, gruff, asking her what was wrong, encouraging her to talk, promising to help. But she'd never accepted his offer of counseling. She hadn't trusted anyone at the time, especially a man. A shiver rippled through her.
"Coach Gleason?"
He nodded against her.
"Yes. You ruined my life."
Beth gripped the man's hand at her throat. She had to find some leverage to knock him off guard and get that knife.
"I'm sorry,"
Beth whispered.
But those girls—
I didn't kill anyone, he growled. Not Kelly Cousins or Sonny or any of the others.
He was pressing her neck so hard he was cutting off her windpipe.
I know you didn't, Beth whispered.
You're lying. You're just saying that to get me to release you.
That's not true. Ian and I have been investigating.
His breath rasped out.
I know. I've been watching.
So she hadn't been paranoid. Footsteps echoed nearby, and he yanked her up against his body, pressing them both to the concrete wall of the building.
Don't try anything,
he murmured.
If you didn't kill those girls, you won't hurt me,
Beth said in a challenge. The knife blade scraped her neck.
I have nothing to lose, JJ. Nothing.
We need your help, Ian said in a voice meant to elicit trust from the Reverend. Whoever killed those girls has a staunch religious background, Ian said. He's ritualistic. Ian gestured toward the candles lined up at the pulpit. He sees himself as a god saving sinners. Reverend Benton's eyes darkened.
You think that's me because I'm a man of the cloth?
That's not what I said, Ian said. Our unsub—
Your what?
Unknown subject, the killer. His victims are from different cities, so we know he travels. He picks the girls up on the road. Ian watched him for a reaction, but Benton remained cool, so he continued. The victims feel safe with him, or they wouldn't go with them willingly. Do you know anyone who fits that description?
No. I'm afraid I can't help you.
I'm sure you hear all kinds of confessions in private, Ian said.
If any such person confessed to me, I'm sworn by the church to keep their confidence.
Benton stroked the sash around his neck.
I pray you find this person, Sheriff. I wish I could help you, but I can't. Now excuse me. I have others who need me.
The Reverend headed toward Coco and Vanessa. Ian wanted to warn them to be careful, but his gut instinct urged him to find Beth. If she'd remembered the killer's face, they might be able to save Prissy Carson. He wove through the crowd, searching the people milling around after the revival and the attendees at the Arts and Crafts Festival. Food trucks were stationed along one end of the park. Country music blared from a stage across the way. A woman carrying baked goods nearly bumped into him, and children laughed at a crafts table where a woman was teaching them how to make paper flowers. A line had formed with people donating blood to the blood bank, and several people had gathered at that artist's booth where he was demonstrating his techniques on canvas. The wooden building housing the restroom sat to the left. Beth might be inside. As he approached, a movement caught his eye. A shadow. There were two people in the corner of the building. One was Beth, the other a man. He moved closer. The man had a knife to her throat. Fear hammered inside Ian. He removed his gun from his holster as he moved toward them. Beth remained silent while a group of people walked by. She had to convince Coach Gleason to release her without anyone being harmed. He tightened his hold around her neck and she gasped for air. More footsteps. Ian appeared around the corner.
Don't do it, son,
Coach said in a low voice. Ian aimed his weapon at the coach. Let her go, Dad. A slight tremble rippled through Gleason. Beth forced herself to stay calm.
I know you've been through hell,
but I want answers, he growled. To clear my name. You can do that.
Then drop the knife,
Beth murmured. His grip on her loosened slightly, and Beth took advantage of the moment and jabbed him in the stomach with her elbow. He grunted and she stomped on his instep. He'd aged 15 years and gained weight, but he snatched her arm as she tried to escape. They rolled and fought for the knife. Beth kneed him in the groin, then shoved him backward. He lost the knife, then crawled after it. Ian fired at the ground. Don't move, Dad. Beth spun around and pushed to her feet. Coach Gleason froze, a feral gleam in his eyes.
You want to shoot me, Ian, go ahead, but I'm not going back to prison.
We have to do this the right way, Ian said. Go through the courts. A girl is missing now.
I never laid a hand on any teenage girl.
What about Kelly Cousins? Were you involved with her?
Beth asked. The coach barked a sarcastic laugh.
I never touched her,
Coach said vehemently.
I swear, Ian. She talked to me about her depression. Perhaps she developed a crush on me, but I wouldn't have let it go anywhere. For God's sake, she was a kid. And I loved your mother.
Then why run and hide out after the flood? Ian asked.
Because I tried to get an appeal and it was denied, he said. I figured if anyone had to prove my innocence, it was me. I couldn't do that behind bars.
Indecision flickered in Ian's eyes. Beth's heart hurt for him. The coach had been the only father Ian had ever known.
The only way to clear you is to go back,
Beth said. He shook his head, a wildness in his eyes born of fear and desperation. He'd been wronged by the law and his wife, and suffered God knows what in prison, then had been hiding out in these mountains for years. She had to make this easy for Ian. She aimed her gun at the man.
Coach Gleason, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent.
I won't go back to jail.
He started toward her, and Ian shouted a warning.
Stop,
Beth cried. But he didn't seem to hear. He charged her, and Beth reacted on instinct. She fired a bullet into his chest. The coach grunted, his eyes widening in shock as he pressed his hand to the wound. Blood oozed between his fingers as he dropped to his knees. Every nerve in Tandy Pooler Benton's body clenched like a fist. She'd heard that sheriff from Podunk Graveyard Falls talking to her husband, Jim, and then that woman, Beth Fields. She wasn't stupid. She'd read the paper. That lady was J.J. Jones. She'd gone missing 15 years ago. Supposedly she had no memory of her abductor's face or name. For now. What if she remembered? Tandy had to do everything she could to protect her husband. That was what good wives did. After all, she'd been on her way to full whoredom before Jim saved her sorry soul. Not a day went by that he didn't remind her of that, too. She hated it when he reminded her. But God wanted you to be humble, and she was about as humble as a body could get. Jim had taken her in when she was a street girl, just a runaway, and he'd prayed over her night and day, had exorcised the demons from her with his rituals and teachings and lessons. Those lessons hurt, but sinners had to be punished. She rubbed the scars on her arms. They were old, but sometimes she could see the blood dripping from the cuts. Bloodletting was a practice as old as the hills. It enabled the ill and afflicted to purge themselves of poisonous toxins and the evil within. Snake handling was the best way to weed out the weak. Normally Jim used that at the revivals, but with all the publicity in town over that graveyard of bones, he decided to skip it this time. Jim was the wise one, the chosen one, just like his daddy. He'd made her respectable, married her when she'd thought no nice man would take her for a wife. Sure, she had to do things for him, feed his body and sate his fleshly desires, fulfill his every need. But that's what a wife was supposed to do. She couldn't let these damned police mess things up. Like a good, obedient servant, she'd keep her mouth shut. The door to the trailer where she and Jim were staying for the revival screeched open, and her husband strode in, wiping at his forehead with a handkerchief.
"Did you talk to the cops?" he bellowed.
No,
Tandy said, her insides quivering. He slid one hand around her wrist and gripped it so hard she winced.
"You didn't mention the girls?"
Tandy shook her head vehemently.
No, I swear. I love you, Jim. I know you believe what you're doing is right.
His gray eyes pierced her.
"Are you saying you don't think it is?"
Fear crawled through Tandy.
That's not what I mean. You save lives, Jim. I'm grateful to be part of that.
The last girl's screams had torn her stomach in knots, though. Tandy did her best to drown out the sound. Nothing kept the screams quiet, though. But she dared not cross her husband. She knew what would happen if she did. Chapter 23. Ian's hand jerked as he lowered his gun and rushed toward his father. He couldn't believe he'd finally found him, and now he might lose him all over again. Threatening Beth had been a mistake, though. Blood gushed from his father's chest. His face was turning gray, his eyes drifting shut. Ian's world blurred. He heard Beth's voice behind him. She was on the phone.
This is Special Agent Beth Fields. I need an ambulance. A man has been shot.
Her voice faded as she recited the address. Ian dragged out a handkerchief to press against his father's wound to slow the bleeding. People must have heard the gunshot, and a crowd began to gather. Beth took charge, securing the area and asking everyone to stay back. Voices rumbled through the crowd, people shouting questions at once. "Who is he? What happened? Is he dead?" "He's going to be all right," Beth said, although she couldn't know that. She was simply trying to appease the crowd. His father was losing blood too fast. He coughed and tried to speak, but his words came out garbled. "Someone get some paper towels from the bathroom," Beth ordered. His father tugged at Ian's arm.
"Didn't kill anyone, I swear."
Emotions flooded Ian. A man shoved a handful of paper towels toward him, and Ian pressed them on top of the handkerchief and added pressure. "I know, Dad. That's what I tried to tell you. Some of the bodies—" His father passed out before Ian could finish. Beth touched his shoulder, but he jerked away. A siren wailed in the distance, the sound growing louder as the ambulance got closer. "Dad, hang in there," Ian said. "We're going to get you to the hospital. Then we'll clear your name." But his father lay limp, unresponsive. An apology flickered in Beth's eyes, but he didn't have time to deal with it. The ambulance screeched to a stop in the parking lot by the building, and two medics retrieved a stretcher and rushed toward them. The crowd parted. He waved the medics to his father's side, then stepped away to give them room to check his vitals. They patted the wound with blood stoppers, then lifted him onto the stretcher and rushed back to the ambulance. Ian followed. "I'm going with you." The medic started to argue, but Ian flashed his badge. "This man is a wanted criminal. I have to escort him." More importantly, he wanted to be close by in case his father tried to talk. Bits and pieces of the past played behind Beth's eyes, the coach promising to help her years ago, offering to talk to the social worker. He'd given her a card with his phone number on it and encouraged her to call him. But she'd been too embarrassed because he'd guessed what was going on in the Otter's house. May's face flashed again, and Beth struggled to recall that night, to see past her to the driver. But his face was cast in a dark shadow. Voices jarred her back to reality. The medics were moving with the coach, Ian following. She ordered the crowd to disperse, then caught Ian just as he was climbing into the ambulance. "I'll go too." She reached for the door to join him, but Ian shook his head. "You've done enough, Beth." Bitterness darkened his eyes as he shoved the keys to his SUV in her hand. Then he shut the ambulance door in her face. A second later, the medic started the engine, flipped on the siren, and raced away. Beth jogged toward Ian's police vehicle, fired up the engine, and followed the ambulance, praying that Coach Gleason didn't die. Ian would never forgive her if he did. Ian gripped his father's hand as the ambulance sped toward the hospital. The medic started an IV and oxygen, but his blood pressure was dropping, his pulse weak. Damn it, he couldn't die. Not when they had a chance to be father and son again. The ambulance bounced over a rut in the road, and his father groaned. Ian glanced at the medic. "You think he'll make it?" The young man shrugged. "He's lost a lot of blood. Depends on internal injuries, if the bullet hit a major artery." Ian scrubbed a hand through his hair, the scene between his father and Beth bothering him. Would his father have hurt Beth if she hadn't shot him? The ambulance swerved into the parking lot and squealed to a stop. Beth swung into the ER parking lot behind them and parked. A flurry of nurses and doctors greeted them at the ER entrance. The medic cited his father's vitals, and the medical staff shouted orders and directions as they ran inside. Chaos ensued as they pushed him into a triage room. Ian tried to go inside with him, but a male nurse blocked his way. "Sorry, sir, you need to wait outside." "He's my father," Ian said, "and he's in my custody." "He's not going anywhere until after surgery," the nurse said. "Let us do our jobs." Ian bit back a response. He needed to talk to his father again. But the nurse pointed toward the waiting room, and Ian had to concede. Frustration knotted Ian's insides as he walked back to the waiting room. Beth rushed in just as he pulled his phone from his pocket to call his mother. She had a right to know his dad was alive. Beth approached him, but the image of her firing that gun into his father's chest made him rush toward the coffee machine. If she'd remembered who'd abducted her, his father would have been cleared. He wouldn't be a fugitive, and he wouldn't be in a damn hospital fighting for his life. On some level, he realized he was being irrational, but he couldn't help himself. His family had been destroyed by JJ's case. The phone rang 3-4 times. Then a male voice answered.
Woods residence. Bernie, it's Ian. I need to speak to Mom. She doesn't want to talk to you. You mean you don't want her to talk to me? It's my job as her husband to protect her, Bernie said. Ian clenched the phone so hard his fingers went numb. She doesn't need protection from me. I'm her son, and I'm tired of you coming between us. Your mother's found peace in the church, Bernie said. I'd think you would want that. I do. That's the reason I'm calling. I have proof that my father is innocent. She needs to know that. Leave her alone, Ian. The phone went dead. Ian cursed. Ever since his mother had married that holier-than-thou asshole, she'd withdrawn from Ian. Bernie had destroyed her confidence in herself. He wanted control. All along, Ian had held hope that proving his father's innocence would help him get her back. But Bernie was still in the way. Ian shoved some quarters into the coffee machine, waited for it to dispense the coffee, and headed back down the hall. Beth was pacing the waiting room, her expression torn. She started toward him, then hesitated, chewing on her thumbnail. Ian, don't, he said. I understand you did what you had to do, but you have no idea what it's like to lose your family. No, I guess I don't. Hurt flared in her eyes. Although Sonny was my family. I was supposed to take care of her, Ian, but I got her killed. Shit, that wasn't what he meant. One of the nurses appeared. Sheriff Kimball? He faced her, praying she didn't have bad news. That's me. Your father refuses to have the operation until he sees you. She ushered him through the ER to a room where they'd prepped his father. His father's eyes were closed, his face so gray that Ian was afraid he was too late. A groan rumbled from his father, and Ian took his hand. Dad? He wheezed for a breath. Ian? Ian swallowed hard. I'm here. Didn't do it, he murmured. I know, Ian said, battling fear and annoyance. Files, his father's voice cracked. School files. Answers there. The stolen ones? Where are the files? Cabin, he said, gasping for a breath. Where? My pocket. A map, his father said. I was going to give it to JJ. See if she remembered someone. You think someone from school kidnapped her and Sonny? Ian asked. His father groaned again. Student, his father said between coughs. Some troubled kids. One of them had a crush on Kelly. He made up those rumors. His father's voice faded. Ian wanted the kid's name. Dad, talk to me. Who was it? He patted his father's cheek to wake him, but he'd lapsed into unconsciousness. Ian glanced at the nurse. You have his clothes? She gestured toward a bag on the floor in the corner. Ian crossed the room and rifled through it. His shirt had been cut off and was soaked in blood. His jeans were old and frayed, but Ian found a scrap of paper in the pocket with a crude map. Take care of him, he told the nurse. He squeezed his father's arm. Fight like hell, Dad. I'll find the truth. Then I'll be back. He clutched the map in his hand and strode through the ER. Beth met him at the door, questions in her eyes. He didn't have time to hash over what had happened. If those files gave them the answers they needed, they might save Prissy Carson's life. It was time to say his final goodbyes to Prissy Carson, but he couldn't carry her to the holler. The police and feds were all over the town asking questions, getting close. He touched the most recent vials of the blood he'd collected, memorizing the names. How many would he have to take to win his own salvation? The paintings he'd finished with the girl's blood were lined against the wall of his storage room. Their blood decorated the interior of the cavern as well. A noise sounded from outside the room, then the ping of water dripping. Another sound a second later. Footsteps in the hall of the cavern. He froze. No one knew about his place but him. Sweat pooled on his neck. He snuffed out the candle in the corner and flattened himself against the wall. The door groaned open. The candlelight from the hall flowed inside in tiny glimmers, just enough to allow him to see who'd discovered his secret. His son's face filled the light. Shock, disgust, intrigue, a myriad of emotions in the boy's eyes.
The words of his own father reverberated in his ears, the day his father told him about the calling. It was time to pass on the message. He led his son to the wall of blood and began the story. Chapter 24. Ian needed distance between himself and Beth. He understood the reason she'd shot his father. Hell, he'd almost pulled the trigger when he'd seen that knife in his father's hands. But the situation was too damn complicated. His guilt, hers, the dead girls deserving justice, all those families needing answers. Beth's tortured expression made his gut clench. "How is he?" "They're taking him to surgery." Ian pulled the map from his pocket. "He stole the files from the school. He was going to give them to you." "What's in the files?" Beth asked. Ian shrugged. "He said a student made up the story about Kelly and Dad, but he didn't say who. I'm going to get the files." "Give me the map and I'll go," Beth said. Ian hesitated. He wanted to stay here and make sure his father survived the surgery. But Prissy Carson's life hung in the balance, and he needed to retrieve the files ASAP. And Beth wanted the truth as much as, or maybe more than, he did. Still, the unsub knew Beth's identity, knew where she lived. He might be watching her, following her. Ian couldn't stand the thought of the sicko hurting her again. "We'll both go." "No, Ian," Beth said softly. "You need to be here when your father wakes up." He shifted, debating what to do. "What happened when we were talking to Reverend Benton?" Turmoil darkened her eyes. "I remembered one particular revival, the one we went to the night before I ran away. The senior Reverend Benton was preaching. He frightened me. They were handling snakes. Later I peeked into one of the tents, and he'd restrained this young girl and was performing an exorcism. I didn't know people still did that. He did. The girl was screaming for help as he chanted and prayed over her. He also talked about bloodletting, said he'd drain the bad blood from her and she'd be healed." Ian straightened. "He sliced her wrists?" "No. Her mother was there and stopped them from the bloodletting. I was so terrified I ran. Mr. Otter caught me and threatened to beat me if I told anyone." She hesitated. "Maybe Jim Benton is following in his father's footsteps." "I'll ask my deputy to tail him," Ian said. "If he's hiding something or has Prissy, maybe we'll catch him in the act." "Give me the map and I'll retrieve those files." Ian licked his dry lips. "Beth," she patted her gun. "Trust me to do my job for the both of us," Beth said. "I'll keep my eyes open. If he's tailing me, I'll call for backup." Their fingers brushed as Beth took the map, making her skin tingle. Ian looked so lost and upset that she wanted to comfort him. But if his father died, he'd hate her, so she rushed toward the door. The sooner she found the cabin, the sooner she'd have access to those files and what was inside. The skies had turned a murky gray with rain clouds, and the wind had picked up, tossing leaves and debris across the entrance to the ER. Instinct urged her to look over her shoulder. For years, she'd sensed Coach Gleason had been following her, and she'd been right. The unsub had been watching her, too. She climbed into Ian's police SUV and peeled from the parking lot. Although she was new to Graveyard Falls, she'd traveled to the mountains before, and she recognized the general area on the map. It was slightly north of the falls the town was named for. Traffic was minimal, night setting in, and she flipped on her lights. The mountains rose around her, lush with newly budding trees, the wind echoing off the sharp ridges. Coyotes, bears, mountain lions, and other wild animals lived in these hills, a perfect place to hide. A truck passed her on a winding curve, and she sucked in a sharp breath. Crazy driver. It sped on, and she flipped her lights to low beam as she met two other vehicles on another switchback. She slowed, tires grinding on the shoulder as she tried to avoid hitting a sedan that crossed the line. More storm clouds moved across the sky, obliterating the moon. She passed the turnoff for Hemlock Holler, checked the map, and turned at the point where the rocks were shaped like a bear. She heard the sound of an engine behind her, a pickup truck on her tail. She hit the gas to move out of the way, but the truck accelerated and slammed into her rear. Beth jerked forward and braked, but the SUV skidded into a spin.
A second later, the truck shifted and backed up, then raced toward her again. She braced herself for the impact and reached for her gun. She didn't have time to aim. The truck slammed into the driver's door and sent the SUV skidding in the opposite direction toward the embankment. Beth screamed as the guardrails came at her. God help her, she was going over. Terrified, she flung open her door and threw herself out of the car. The SUV sailed over the side of the mountain and crashed below. She hit the pavement with her shoulder, and a teeth-jarring pain ripped through her arm. Gasping for a breath, she rolled to her side, gripped her gun, and took aim. The truck sat facing her, the lights blinding her. She thought the windows were tinted, but it didn't matter. The headlights were so bright that she had to cover her eyes with her hand. The engine fired up. Was he coming at her again? She pulled the trigger. The driver revved the truck engine. Just as she'd feared, he drove straight toward her. Beth fired again, but the bullet pinged off the pavement. The lights grew closer, the engine roaring. She rolled again and ended up sliding over the mountain ridge. A boom reverberated through the air. Ian's SUV burst into flames at the bottom of the drop-off. She screamed and reached for something to hang on to, a limb jutting from the ground. She closed her fingers around it, but it snapped. Terror seized her. If she lost hold, she'd plummet to her death. Ian considered calling the director, but the man had ordered Beth to leave the case alone, so he phoned Deputy Markham instead and relayed what had happened. "I'm at the hospital. My father's in surgery. I've been watching Benton like you requested. He went home with his wife a while ago. You want me to come to the hospital?" "No, stay with Benton." Ian disconnected and went to get another cup of coffee. Through the window by the coffee machine, he watched the sky darken, the wind blowing the trees as if another tornado might be on the horizon. Fuck. That was the last thing Graveyard Falls needed. They were barely surviving their recent losses and tangling with another lunatic killer. The seconds ticked by excruciatingly slowly as Ian paced the waiting room. He wanted news, damn it. For the surgery to be over, for his father to live, for his mother to act like she gave a damn. Although as soon as his father went to prison, Bernie Woods had walked into her life and acted like her savior. First, he'd been a concerned friend, but soon she'd fallen under some kind of spell when Bernie was around. And the Reverend Jim Benton, his mother acted as if he were a god. Could Jim Benton have something to do with these murders? If he was performing exorcisms, had he gone too far? Although Jim Benton had only been a teenager when JJ and Sonny disappeared, something didn't fit. Ian gripped his coffee, stewing over the information they had. They were missing something. His father had kept those files for a reason. They held the key. Anxious to know what was in them, he punched Beth's number. Her phone rang and rang, but no one answered. Chapter 25. Beth's arms trembled as she strained to hold on to the ledge. Her first instinct was to scream for help, but the driver who'd hit her had stopped. Was he going to make sure she was dead? Gravel crunched, dirt pelted her face. He was coming toward her. Terrified, she glanced down. A small ridge was a few feet below. If she could make it, she could hide beneath the overhang. Then her attacker would think she'd fallen over the ledge. If she missed, she'd fall hundreds of feet to her death. Her arms shook with the effort to hang on. The footsteps sounded again. It was now or never. She whispered a silent prayer, then gauged the distance and width of the ledge and dropped straight down. Thank God her feet hit, but the impact jarred her teeth and her ankle twisted. Pain ricocheted up her leg as she fell to her knees. Her other foot slid over the edge and she almost lost her balance and slipped over. She bit back a scream and clawed at the rocky ledge for control. Heart racing, she crawled beneath the overhang and plastered herself to the wall. She was so dizzy her breathing came out in short pants. She drew her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and laid her head on her hands. The world spun, the past few minutes replaying in her mind. Who had been driving that truck? Several seconds passed. The air was colder on top of the mountain, the wind sucking at her. Metal popped and glass shattered below. Smoke and fire shot into the air, the blaze leaping as the gas tank exploded. She covered her head with her hands and forced herself to take deep breaths. Finally, her nerves calmed, and the dizziness subsided.
As the fire began to die down, she craned her head, listening for sounds of the driver or his vehicle. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Grateful it was on silent, she carefully removed it and glanced at the number. Ian. She fought the urge to answer. She couldn't give herself away. She strained to hear above her. The wind picked up. The smoke grew thicker. There was no way she could climb that ledge. Fear mingled with panic. Another minute passed, then another. Finally, the sound of an engine starting broke the silence. She gripped her phone and called Ian. Ian's phone buzzed at the same time the surgeon appeared at the doorway of the waiting room. He glanced at the number. Beth. He'd call her back. First he had to see if his father had made it. He rushed to the doorway. "I'm Ian Kimball. How's my dad?" "We managed to remove the bullet, and he made it through surgery. Thankfully, the bullet missed his main artery, but other internal organs were damaged." "Not good." "Is he going to survive?" Ian asked. The surgeon gave him a non-committal look. "The next 24 hours will tell. He's lost a lot of blood and has lapsed into a coma." Ian's chest clenched. "What does that mean?" The doctor shifted. "His body needs rest and time to recover." "How long?" A grave expression tugged at the surgeon's eyes. "It could be hours, could be days." Ian gave a quick nod. "Do you know who he is?" "I'm aware that he was shot by a federal agent, and that he was handcuffed when he arrived," the doctor said tersely. "But I assure you that that played no part in my surgery." "I didn't mean to imply that it did." Ian explained about his father's history. "A deputy will guard him 24/7. Please call me if there's any change in his condition. It's important that I speak to him the moment he regains consciousness." The doctor pushed his surgical cap back on his head. "I'll alert the staff." Ian shook the man's hand and thanked him again. His phone was buzzing once more. Beth. Maybe she'd found something. He quickly connected. "It's Ian." "Help me, Ian," Beth rasped. "I need you." Fear slammed into Ian. "What's wrong? Where are you?" "A wreck." Static rattled over the line, the wind howling in the background. "On a mountain ledge." He raced toward the door. "What? Jesus, Beth, what happened?" "A truck ran me off the road." More static. "Where?" "On the way to the cabin," she said over the noise. Panic set in. "I'll be there as soon as possible. Are you hurt?" More static. He shook his phone. He couldn't hear a damn thing. God, what if she'd lost consciousness? A siren wailed from an incoming ambulance outside. Tires squealed as another car roared up behind it. A group of people were leaving, one woman crying on a man's shoulder. He glanced at the parking lot and realized Beth had his SUV. Fuck. He ran back to the nurse's station. "I need an ambulance. A federal agent had an accident on the mountain." She picked up the phone and consulted with someone. A minute later, 2 medics appeared. "What's the address?" one of them asked. Damn it, he'd given Beth the map, but he knew the general area. He'd looked for signs of an accident. "I'm not sure, but I can take you there." Beth clenched her phone with clammy hands. Deja vu struck her. She'd had that feeling of helplessness before, a feeling of despair, when she'd been restrained by the man who'd killed Sonny. She hugged the wall of the mountain, her gaze scanning the valley below. Thick trees climbed the hills, their limbs bared. The fire from the SUV lit the night. A patch of evergreens caught her eye, then a rock formation that reminded her of a cross. Dear God, she recognized that place. Images swirled behind her eyes, kneeling before that cross, being baptized in the springs nearby. No, not nearby. In the cave behind those rocks. The rocks were a natural formation. Tiny crystals hung from the ceiling inside that sparkled and resembled angels. His deep voice reverberated in her ears. He'd picked the place because it was sacred. He claimed he was the chosen one. Chill bumps cascaded up her arms and neck. The cave where he'd held her, where he'd bled Sonny and the other girls to death. She remembered. Her heart jumped to her throat. If she could lead Ian there, they might find evidence to determine the unsub's identity and save Prissy. A siren wailed, signaling its approach. She eased an inch away from the wall, then twisted to look upward. An engine rumbled. Gravel crunched. Footsteps. She held her breath. The driver could have come back. The wind rustled the trees. Metal popped from below, and smoke clouded her eyes. "Beth!" Ian's voice carried in the wind. "Beth, are you down there?" Relief surged through her, and she released the breath she'd been holding. "Yes, I'm on the ledge." "How the hell did you get there?" Ian asked. "I jumped when the car started over the edge." A dizzy spell assaulted her as she looked down. Smoke billowed from his SUV, a fiery blaze curling upward. She clung to the rock, shaky and terrified she might slip. "I can't climb up," she yelled. "Hang on," Ian shouted. "Let me get a rope." Beth heaved a sigh of relief. When they got her up, she'd tell Ian about the cave. Prissy Carson might be there now. Cold fear consumed Ian. How in the world had Beth landed on that ridge and not plunged to her death? His car had nosedived into the rocks below and was smoldering, a total loss. Beth would have been too if she hadn't jumped. Shit. He ran back to the medics. "Do you have some strong rope I can use?" One of the medics jogged to the ambulance and returned with a thick rope. The other medic shined a flashlight to illuminate the area, then helped Ian secure the rope to a boulder. Ian tied it around his waist and climbed down the ledge. Beth was plastered against the rocky wall, trembling. He steadied himself and inched to her. She fell against his chest, and he couldn't help himself. He cradled her against his body and rocked her in his arms. Chapter 26. Beth hated herself for being weak, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away. Ian's arms felt warm and solid, comforting, strong. For a brief second, she felt safe, as if her past wasn't about to catch up with her. She'd been running from it all her life, hiding behind a new identity, trying to save other girls to compensate for not saving Sonny. "Beth?" Ian's gruff voice shook her back to reality. She'd shot Ian's father, and he was in the hospital fighting for his life. She didn't know if he'd survived the surgery. But Ian had just saved her life anyway. She inhaled a deep breath and removed herself from his embrace. "I'm sorry." Ian brushed her hair from her cheek. "Are you hurt?" "No, just shaken." "Then let's get you off this ledge." She caught his arm as he began to loosen the rope. "Ian, what about your father?" "He's in a coma." He slid the rope around her waist and tied it securely. "The medics are going to pull you up. Hang on tight." "I don't know if I can do it," she whispered. "I hate heights." Ian cupped her face between his hands. "You can do anything, Beth. You're the bravest woman I've ever met. Just don't look down." He gave her a deep kiss on the lips, and thoughts of the ledge faded. He yelled for the medics. She took a deep breath, gripped the rope, and began to climb the ledge as the medics hauled her up. Her legs and arms were shaking by the time she reached the top, and the men helped her over the edge. She fell onto the ground, panting, still reeling from that kiss. One of the medics untied the rope and threw it down to Ian. Beth brushed dirt from her face and clothes as she watched them help Ian climb to the top. His breathing rasped out as he untied himself and crawled to her. "Are you okay?" She nodded. The medic checked her vitals, but she refused to go to the hospital. "Ian, I remembered something. We need to go." She signed a waiver for the medics just as CSU and Deputy Whitehorse arrived. The deputy was going to oversee the investigators and then hitch a ride back with the CSU. Whitehorse turned his keys over to Ian. She and Ian hurried to his police car. They had to find that cave. Hopefully they'd find Prissy there, alive. Beth's statement spiked Ian's adrenaline, giving him hope they'd find the sick bastard who'd murdered the girls. The unsub had let Beth go free once, but today he'd returned to kill her. Why? Because he was afraid she'd remembered his face? "Where's this cave?" Ian asked. Beth tried to smooth her hair into some kind of order. "Behind those rocks to the east. The rock formation is unique. It's a natural formation that resembles a cross." Ian veered onto the highway. "Did you see the person or vehicle that hit you?" "No. His lights were so bright they blinded me."
But it was a truck. Ian steered the car onto the highway, then headed around the mountain. What about the make and model? Color? Beth massaged her temple. Black, maybe. That's good, Ian said. Anything else? Was it a short bed, long bed? I couldn't tell, Beth said. When he hit me, he must have damaged his own vehicle. I'll text Peyton and ask her to search for a black pickup being serviced for body damage, and to look in the system for locals who might drive a black truck. He maneuvered a series of switchbacks, alert for the truck in case the driver returned. Beth finished the text, then pointed to a V in the road. It's that way. Ian maneuvered the turn easily, his gut tightening. They had to hurry. Anxiety gnawed at Beth. Soon she would be at the cave, back to that torture chamber where she'd been held like an animal, forced to beg for her life. The sedan bounced over ruts in the dirt as Ian plowed along. The road that led into the woods was barely a road, more like a path that had been cut by a tractor. She closed her eyes and tried to recall how the unsub had brought her and Sonny here. She'd been unconscious, but she faintly remembered the rumble of an engine. She'd stirred a few times, only to be slammed against the truck wall by the impact of a pothole. Then her head had spun and she'd passed out again. Ian suddenly came to a halt. Tires ground the gravel. Beth stared into the dark forest. Night creatures howled and an owl hooted. Leaves rustled. The road ends here. Ian laid his hands on the steering wheel, frustration lining his face. What do we do now? Beth climbed from the car. The wind chilled her, or maybe being close to the cave where Sonny had died was making her cold from the inside out. The sound of water rippling over rocks broke the night. The river was close by. They needed to follow it. She paused, another memory surfacing. Water dripping in the cave. The pool where he'd baptized them. It was some kind of springs the creek fed into. She pivoted toward the sound. This way. We have to hike in. He carried you in on foot? Beth rubbed her temple again, snippets of the past returning in jarring bits. He had some kind of wagon or board in the back of the truck. He used it to haul us. She swallowed. I remember being tied to it, trying to claw my way to reach Sonny. Ian retrieved 2 flashlights from the sedan and handed her one. Determined, she forged ahead, using the flashlight to shine a path. Their boots made crunching sounds on the dry leaves. A mountain lion growled somewhere in the distance. Other forest creatures darted through the weeds and brambles as if they thought she and Ian were hunting them. A buck hesitated in the sliver of light from her flashlight and looked up at her, startled. She knew how the animal felt, trapped, always watching for a predator, using the trees and brush to camouflage their true colors, just as she hid behind her job and gun. It was the only place she'd ever felt safe, except she'd felt safe in Ian's arms earlier, safe and cared for. He was just doing his job, she reminded herself as she stepped over a broken tree limb. Other branches had been flung down and shattered in the tornado. She lost her way for a second, confused. Which way to go? The dark sucked her in, the scent of marshy earth, the ripple of the water, the stench of blood. She pivoted toward the sound of the water, followed the stream, and it would lead them to the baptismal pool. Follow the scent of blood that had permeated her soul for years, and it would lead her to the evil one who'd destroyed her life. Ian checked his watch. They'd been hiking for 20 minutes. He hoped to hell Beth was right about this place. Occasionally she stopped and scanned the area as if she was lost. Maybe she was. Lost in the traumatic memories of her abduction and her friend's murder. She stumbled over a tree root and he caught her arm. She might have hurt her ankle, but it hadn't slowed her down. Once she'd heard that rippling water from the river and the creek, she'd taken off, shoving brush and branches aside as she followed the sound. Ian imagined her at 15, how terrified she'd been. They broke through a small clearing and he stopped behind Beth, giving her space and time to think. Her eyes were dark with pain, haunted with the reality of what they might find, but she shifted to the left and led the way. She was the strongest, most courageous woman he'd ever met. A deer ran past, then another. So much beauty in the midst of the dark, thick foliage.
So much danger for a girl alone with no one to guide her through life. Beth came to a halt again. He inched closer to her, senses alert. A cold breeze ruffled the leaves and brought with it the strong smell of earth and death. Beth pointed to the cluster of rocks that resembled a cross. He surveyed the area surrounding the rocks. More trees, a small clearing, a pool of water fed by the creek to the right. He clenched his hands. This was the spot she'd talked about, where the bastard had baptized the girls before he slit their wrists. "He forced us to kneel before the cross while he prayed over us," Beth said in a low whisper. "He said he was chosen to save us from a life of sin." Ian muttered a curse. He'd never understood psycho freaks who used religion as a justification to kill. She started ahead, and he caught her arm and gestured for her to stay behind him. She might outrank him, but revisiting the place where she'd been held and seen her friend die was traumatic. He wanted to protect her. "Let me go in first." A myriad of emotions glittered in her eyes. Indecision, fear, resignation, determination. Then a long-suffering sigh and a nod. He eased forward, careful to keep his senses honed. So far, he didn't detect anyone around. No wagon or board the unsub used to haul anyone in. Maybe Beth was wrong. He might have used this cave long ago, but found a new spot. Behind Ian, Beth's breathing brushed his neck. Choppy and uneven, it cut through the air, a reminder of her personal stake in this mess. She gestured to a cluster of branches and limbs stacked in front of stone. He crossed to it, yanked the branches and limbs away, and tossed them into a pile. A door was underneath. Beth's pain-filled gasp made him tense. He removed his gun and held it at the ready, as he eased open the wooden door built into the opening. Had this once been some kind of mine? The interior was so dark that he blinked to clear his vision. The rancid scent of death was overpowering. He yanked a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it over his mouth, then motioned for Beth to stay outside. She shook her head no, determination hardening her expression. He handed her the handkerchief and then directed the beam of light around the interior and listened. No sounds of anyone inside, no footsteps or voices, no one crying out for help. Slowly he crept deeper into the cave. 100 feet in, he spotted another door. He pushed it open, gun braced and ready to fire. Beth gasped again. Ian pulled her to him to hide her from the grisly sight. They were too late. Prissy Carson was lying on the ground, tied and bound, her body still, her eyes wide open in death. Chapter 27. Beth stared at Prissy Carson in horror. Just like the girls they'd found in the holler, she was dressed in a sheer white cotton dress that resembled a christening gown. Bitterness blended with anger and guilt, and Beth broke down. The sobs that came from her were ripped from her soul. This was so unfair. Prissy was so young. She should be alive, talking to her friends, planning her first school dance. Ian's curse reminded her that she wasn't alone, and she swiped at her tears. Ian slowly knelt beside the girl and pressed 2 fingers to Prissy's neck, checking for a pulse, although it was obvious she was dead. The candle in Prissy's hand had burned down, the wax clumping on her fingers. Blood spatter dotted the floor. "She's in rigor," Ian said, "but she hasn't been dead long." Self-hate hit Beth like a sledgehammer. If she'd been able to lead her FBI team and the police to this place sooner, they would have saved Prissy's life. An hour, maybe even minutes, could have made a difference. She shined her flashlight across the interior of the cave, sickened at the swirls of blood on the wall. Religious symbols covered the stone, a cross, angels, a Bible verse. Ian's voice startled her. "Yes, Lieutenant Ward, send another crime team. We found the kill spot. Hopefully he left DNA somewhere in here." Ian gave him the coordinates, ended the call, and then examined the girl's face for injuries. "Except for the fatal slash of her wrist, it doesn't look like he tortured her or hurt her." "The mental torture was enough," Beth said in disgust. Another memory rose from the grave of her mind. He dipped his fingers into Sonny's blood and painted the outline of an angel on the wall. "He used the girl's blood to paint the symbols on the wall," Beth said. "It's part of his ritual." "I thought you said he collects their blood in a vial." Beth nodded. "He does both." Another image flashed behind her eyes. The blood-spattered cloth he'd placed below the bodies. "He studies the blood spatter," she said. "It intrigues him. He paints an image based on what he sees in the spatter." Beth snapped back into agent mode and took pictures of the symbols. Using both hands, Ian pressed the wall, pushing along a portion that was cracked. The wall began to move. A door in the cave. What was on the other side? Beth's statement about the killer studying the blood spatter ran through Ian's mind as he stepped inside the room. The walls were covered in blood. Blood from his victims. A natural hot spring pool gurgled in the center. "He uses that pool to baptize the girls," Beth said in a distant voice, as if she were drowning in the past. "I thought he did that outside," Ian said. Beth wrinkled her nose. "Maybe he uses both. The outside one in pretty weather, this one when it's cold or snowy." "He baptized them here, then carried them to the holler to bury them," Ian said. Beth nodded. "Since we discovered his burial ground, he left Prissy here. That has to be bothering him." Beth snapped more pictures of the gruesome scene. "He doesn't know we found this place yet. He might return." "Yeah, with another victim." Beth heaved a weary sound. "I'll have to let the director know we found Prissy and this place. We should station someone here to watch the cave." "I'll do it." Ian made the call, but there was no answer, so he left a voicemail for the director. "CSU is on its way. Since this was his private kill spot, there's a good chance the unsub left fingerprints or forensics." Beth examined the cross around the girl's neck, then the cross on the wall. "There's something about his art that seems familiar." "You saw him painting the symbols when he held you?" Ian asked. Beth worried her bottom lip with her teeth. "Yes, but I've also seen similar paintings somewhere else." Ian froze, his brain working. He'd seen a painting that reminded him of this bloody artwork, too. Where was it? His phone buzzed with a text. Ward and his team had arrived. "I'm going to meet Ward." "I'll wait here." Guilt and grief clouded her eyes. "I don't want to leave Prissy alone." He understood. He hated to leave her, too, but they needed to work fast. "I'll be back soon." He strode through the cave and out the door, grateful for the fresh air. The sooner they processed this place, the sooner they might find DNA and stop this maniac. The smell of blood was fresh in his mind as he backtracked through the woods. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, a wild animal howled. The wind picked up and hurled a tree branch to the ground. He pivoted, the hair on the back of his neck prickling. Prissy's body hadn't been that cold. What if the unsub had been nearby when they arrived? He shouldn't have left Beth alone. The cave walls closed in around Beth. Remembering that she was a trained agent, she fought the temptation to run her fingers over some of the religious symbols painted on the wall. She needed to protect the evidence. The sound of Sonny's cries reverberated off the walls. Then Prissy's. She sank down beside Prissy, her heart aching as she imagined how terrified the teenager must have been. "I'm so sorry, honey," Beth whispered. "We tried to find you in time, but we failed." Defeat and anger weighed on her. The gurgling of the pool water carried her back years. Desperate to see the killer's face, she closed her eyes and allowed the emotions and memories to flow through her. Sonny was curled up beside her, crying. She looked so tiny and weak. JJ had to take care of her, had to find a way out for both of them. She swept her gaze across the cave, but it was so dark she couldn't see. Just a tiny sliver of light seeping through a crack in the rock wall. "I'm scared," Sonny whispered. So was she, but she had to be brave. Her hands and feet were bound, so she scooted as close as she could to Sonny and rubbed her arm with both hands. "Shh, I'll get us out of here. I promise." "He's going to kill us," Sonny whispered. JJ shook her head.
No, I'll get help. How? Sonny said on a sob. We don't know where we are. Tears pricked at JJ's eyes, but she blinked them back, then tried to untie the knot at her wrist with her teeth. Sonny was right. If they did find a way out of this dungeon, she had no idea where they were. Caves were in the mountains. No telling how many miles they were from a town or a road. Worse, bears and snakes and other wild animals roamed the hills, but if she could find the river, she could follow it. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Footsteps pounding the rocky floor, then shuffling, and voices. Voices? Not just the man's, another voice, not quite as deep. Male, but younger? Someone was with him. Son, we are the chosen ones. This is our calling. Cold fear enveloped JJ. He was coming back for her and Sonny, and he had a helper. A scream lodged in her throat. Maybe the other one would save them. She swallowed a cry and yanked at the ropes binding her wrists, but she couldn't get the knot to budge. Give me your hands, JJ whispered. If she could untie Sonny, Sonny could untie her. Then she'd find something in the cave to use as a weapon. Sonny was shaking as she lifted her hands. JJ tugged at the ends. The man's voice drifted through the doorway. They cannot help who they are. The sin is in their blood just as it was in hers. Who were they talking about? I'll find a cure, the younger man said. There is no cure, the older man murmured. Only forgiveness through Jesus. Fear choked JJ. The memory of Reverend Benton's ranting screamed through her mind. He was always singing about the blood of Jesus. The door squeaked as it opened. The big hulking figure appeared, drenched in the shadows. Then another figure, smaller, thinner, also in the dark. JJ ripped at the rope with her fingernails, desperate. But the bigger figure loped toward her and Sonny. Sonny screamed, and Beth tried to cover her with her body. He yanked her off Sonny and pushed JJ so hard she fell back against the rocky wall. Pain shot through her skull, and the world spun. Please let her go. Take me instead. She's so little. The man ignored her and dragged Sonny across the floor. JJ crawled after him and clawed at his ankle. Let her go! He kicked backward and slammed his foot into her face. Blood gushed from her nose. The room went completely dark. Beth jerked from the memory just as a footstep creaked. She peered around the cave. Something moved. A man. You remember me, JJ? Beth's pulse quickened. The whisper of a breath puffed in the air. She tried to see him, but he knocked the flashlight on the ground and it went out. She scrambled to retrieve it, but he kicked it away. She froze and reached for her weapon. JJ. The voice. It cut through the silence. Deep, cold. Not a memory. He was here. Yes. Show me your face. A dark chuckle boomeranged off the cold walls. Beth pivoted toward the source and fired the gun. She missed, and the bullet pinged off the wall. She blinked to see where he'd gone, then suddenly he was on her. A second later, the world turned upside down, and she slipped into the dark. The sound of the gunshot triggered Ian's worst fear. He might have lost Beth. What the hell was that? Lieutenant Ward asked. Ian gestured toward the path through the woods. Beth, she's back at the cave. Damn it, he'd had a bad feeling before he met up with the crime team. He took off running, not bothering to wait for the two crime scene investigators climbing from their vehicle. We're right behind you, Ward shouted. Ian drew his weapon and shoved at the branches and weeds, using his flashlight to guide him toward the cave. Something moved to the right. He paused, then spotted a deer. Damn it. He picked up his pace, racing past fallen branches and listening for more gunfire. But he stayed alert in case he was running into a trap. Finally, he reached the clearing. Then the cross-shaped rock formation. Brush moved to the right of the entrance. Was Beth inside, or did he have her? Ward raced up behind him. Check the cave for Beth, Ian said. I saw someone in the woods. I'm going after him. Fear shot through him, and he ran past the cave toward the bushes. He gripped his gun, ready to shoot as he charged forward. A tree limb moved.
More footsteps ahead. Then a figure disappeared through the trees. "Stop! Police!" But the figure didn't slow. Ian picked up his pace and fired, then heard a grunt. The figure veered to the left. He dashed forward and released another shot. Tree limbs shook and leaves scattered as the bushes parted. Damn it, the perp was getting away. Ian pushed through the bushes, then ran through a cluster of pines and searched the forest. The figure had disappeared again, but Beth was lying against a rock, unmoving. Chapter 28. Ian quickly knelt and checked Beth's pulse. She was so still, her face pale, and blood matted her hair. He checked for a gunshot wound, but it looked as if she'd hit her head on a rock. "Beth, honey, talk to me." He leaned closer to her, listening for a breath. Seconds ticked by. Finally, her chest rose and fell. Relief surged through him. A voice broke the quiet. "Sheriff?" Ian pivoted slightly to see Lieutenant Ward approaching. "Call an ambulance," Ian said. "And stay with her. I'm going after him." "Medics are on the way," Ward said. Ian reluctantly left Beth with the CSU and sprinted into the woods. He was so close to catching this SOB, he couldn't waste a second. Bushes parted as he wove through them. Tree limbs snapped and popped. He cursed as he nearly stumbled over a rotting tree stump. The scent of a dead animal assaulted him. A mauled creature in the bushes. Ahead, the forest sounds grew quiet. Wind shrieked through the pines and another animal wailed. The sound of the river rushed over rocks. He pivoted toward it, shining his light in a wide arc as he searched for the unsub. Something moved to the left. His gun at the ready, Ian braced for an attack. A mountain lion growled on a cliff above, its eyes glowing in the dark. For a moment, Ian sensed it was staring straight at him, daring him to charge. The forest became eerily quiet. No voices, no footsteps, no trees parting or twigs breaking. Then a snake hissed behind him. Ian cursed, spun around, and saw the rattler in the weeds, a reminder that dangers lurked everywhere in these mountains and came in all forms. "Fuck you," he muttered to the snake. He fired at the snake, then heard the mountain lion trot away. But there was no sign of the unsub. Where the hell had he gone? How had he escaped? He strode a few more feet. The sound of a motor rumbled in the air. A boat. Shit. The unsub had come via boat, parked along the river, and then carried his victims inside the cave. He checked his phone for reception, then phoned Whitehorse. "Prissy Carson is dead. We found her body in a cave in the mountains. We need a chopper to comb the area along the river heading due east from the coordinates I'm texting you." "They won't be able to find anything this late," Deputy Whitehorse said. "Then tell them at first light to get on it. I want to know where every house, trailer, RV, or campsite is, and I want every one of them searched." "Copy that," Deputy Whitehorse said. "I also need you to make the notification of death to the mother." A tense silence stretched between them. Death notifications were the worst part of a cop's job. Whitehorse had been forced to tell his own sister when their mother had been murdered 3 years ago. But his deputy didn't argue. "Yes, sir." Ian thanked him, then called Markham and explained about the attack. "Where's Benton?" "I don't know. He must have slipped out the back." "Damn it. Find him, Markham." He hung up with a curse. Heart racing, he headed back toward Beth and the cave. Sweat trickled down his neck as he jogged through the woods. The stench of that dead animal assaulted him again, but it was the sight of Beth lying unconscious that made his stomach clench. He'd promised her justice. If he failed her a second time, he might as well turn in his badge. Beth was falling into a deep, dark hole. She flailed her arms in search of something to hold on to, but her fingers connected with empty air. Sonny's screams boomeranged off the cave walls. The metallic scent of blood swirled around her. The faces of the other dead girls floated by her, skeletal hands reaching out, pleading for her to save them. Prissy. Her shocked eyes begged for mercy. She'd wanted to live. Beth hit the hard ground. Then the earth split and sucked her deeper under the surface. More skeletons sailed at her, pummeling her as the grave swallowed her. "Beth, honey, wake up. Tell me you're all right." That voice, it was familiar. almost as familiar as the face of the man hovering above her with the knife. She screamed, kicked, and pushed at him as he came closer. Then the prick of the knife, her own blood seeping out. Blood dripped onto the bones beneath her, the bones he'd made into a bed. "Beth, can you hear me?" Yes, and she wanted to go back to him, escape this grave of horror. But she needed to stay here, too. There was some reason. What was it? His face. She searched the shadows. She needed to see his eyes, needed to know what he looked like. The shadow moved, another inch closer. Then the second figure, smaller. "We have to let her go, Father." She gasped. That other person. He was her age. Dear God, she'd seen him before. Somewhere at school. Who was he? Worry knotted Ian's stomach as he rode in the ambulance with Beth. He'd left Lieutenant Ward the police car and convinced the medics that he needed to be at Beth's side in case she regained consciousness and could identify her attacker. "What happened?" the medic in back asked. "She's an FBI agent working the Boneyard murders. We were investigating and someone attacked her." He lifted her hand in his and squeezed it, hoping for a reaction, but Beth didn't respond. "I'm going to take samples of the blood on her face and scrape beneath her nails in case her attacker left DNA. The medic agreed and watched as Ian examined her hands and face and collected the samples. He found an errant hair strand that looked a lighter shade of brown than Beth's and bagged it to send to the lab. The siren wailed, lights flashing as they careened into the hospital. Beth hadn't stirred, but she was alive. The medics jumped out and rushed into the ER entrance with Beth. A nurse met them and the information exchange began. "BP is low and breathy, heart rate steady. Head injury." Their words blurred in his mind as he followed them inside, and they rushed her to a triage room. Beth opened her eyes and blinked at the bright lights. Machines and voices hummed around her. The scent of antiseptic and medicine permeated her nostrils. "She's back with us," a female voice said. "Hello there, Agent Fields. You're in the hospital." Beth blinked again, confused as she stared into a pair of green eyes. A nurse. She tried to speak, but her throat was so dry she had to swallow twice to make her voice work. "What happened?" "The sheriff who brought you in said you were attacked." The last few hours rushed back. She was in the cave where Sonny had died. She hadn't wanted to leave Prissy Carson alone. Then someone had snuck in. A male figure in a white coat joined the nurse. "Glad to see you've regained consciousness. You have a few stitches in your head and a slight concussion. You'll probably have a headache for a couple of days, but the MRI was clean." Beth shoved at the sheet covering her. "I have to go. I'm working a case." The doctor put out a hand to stop her from climbing from the bed. "You're not going anywhere tonight, Agent Fields." "I'll get the sheriff." The nurse's footsteps padded slowly as she left. The room spun and Beth sank back against the pillow. God help her, she needed to find this bastard. "We want to keep you overnight for observation," the doctor said. The door swung open and Ian appeared, his jaw set tight, his dark eyes pinning her in place. "Beth?" "I'm fine," she murmured, although frustration and a feeling of helplessness brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them away. She was an agent, not some weak victim. Not anymore. Except the maniac who'd killed her friend had ambushed her, because she'd let her emotions get the best of her. It wouldn't happen again. Ian paused by her bed and looked up at the doctor. "Is she going to be all right?" "A light concussion, a few stitches, but the MRI was clean. She should be fine to go home in the morning." "I want to leave now," Beth said, pushing herself up to a sitting position. "We have to find him before he hurts someone else." Ian squeezed her hand. "We will, Beth, but you're not going anywhere. You need to rest." She gripped the edge of the bed with white-knuckled fists. "I should have stopped him a long time ago. I have to do it now." The doctor cleared his throat. "We'll leave you two to talk." The doctor and nurse left the room, and Beth twisted the sheets between her fingers. "I can't believe I let him escape." Ian offered her a sympathetic smile. "You didn't let him get away, Beth. He assaulted you. Judging from your broken nails, I have a feeling you put up a fight." Her heart fluttered. "You got DNA?" I scraped under your nails and sent it to the lab." He stroked a strand of hair from her forehead, his hand so tender that tears threatened again. "Because you fought, we might be able to ID him." Beth's head throbbed relentlessly. She closed her eyes, but the attack had stirred memories to life as if it were happening all over again.
"I remembered something, Ian. When I was abducted, he wasn't alone."
Ian's eyes narrowed. "What?"
"There were two of them," Beth whispered. "A father and a son."
She reached for Ian's hand and clung to it.
"I think I knew the boy. I'm almost certain he attended high school with us."
Two killers could explain how there were so many dead girls over the years and the time span between some of the kills. Also, one killer could provide a diversion, while the other lured the victim into a trap. The girls trusted the teenager because he was near their age. The religious aspects pointed toward Reverend Wally Benton as a person of interest. If he'd killed Sonny, had his son Jim been there to watch or to assist? If one of the killers attended our school, maybe there's something about him in my father's files. That's the reason my father wanted to give them to you." Beth nodded.
"We have to get them."
Ian gently pressed her back onto the bed. "I'll go."
"But Ian—"
"Listen, Beth. The crime team is processing the cave. Deputy Whitehorse is notifying Prissy's mother of her death. And you just gave us a clue." He stroked her cheek with the pad of his thumb. "I'll bring the files here. If you're up to it, we'll study them together." He'd tracked down a yearbook of the students that year as well. If Beth saw the boy's photograph, maybe she'd finally recognize him and put a name to their killer. He guided the boat to the edge of the creek, his adrenaline churning. He'd had JJ in his hands. A few more minutes and he could have escaped with her. He knew she wanted answers. She didn't understand why he'd let her go and killed her friend. He wanted to tell her. He'd kept his secret long enough. But it had been a close call in the woods. Too close. The sheriff had almost caught him. Had JJ seen his face this time? Would she remember him after all these years? His son sat looking at his hands, mesmerized by the blood staining his fingers. For so long he'd studied the blood, kept it and researched the elements. He wanted to know what made some blood bad and others untainted by evil. So far, he hadn't found the answer, but he wouldn't give up. If he did, they would have died for nothing. His son made a low sound in his throat. He'd worried the boy wouldn't accept the calling, that he had his own plans and would defy his destiny. His anxiety dissipated as a smile creased the boy's face. "You have someone in mind, don't you, son? Someone who needs saving." The boy nodded, and everything was as it should be. Chapter 29. Something was wrong. Vanessa heard Grandma Coco on the phone.
"That's awful. Yes, I'll tell her."
Vanessa pressed her hand over her mouth and started to shake. It was bad news. It had to be about Prissy. She stepped into the kitchen. Grandma Coco was leaning on the counter, clutching her chest. She gasped for a breath and then dropped the phone.
"Grandma? Vanessa, baby."
Grandma Coco swayed and staggered to a chair. Terrified, Vanessa ran over to help her.
"What's wrong, Grandma?"
Sweat beaded on her grandma's face.
"Baby, they found Prissy."
Tears pricked at Vanessa's eyes. For Grandma to look this bad, the news must be awful.
"I'm sorry, honey,"
her grandma wheezed. Tears blurred Vanessa's eyes. She wanted to scream no and hit something. Prissy couldn't be dead. She was her age, just a kid. They were supposed to be best friends forever, be college roommates, bridesmaids in each other's weddings. Grandma Coco's eyes turned glassy. More sweat drenched her face. She made a pained sound and toppled from the chair.
"Grandma!"
Vanessa dropped down beside her, but Grandma Coco didn't move. Was she breathing? Cold terror choked Vanessa. She'd lost her best friend. She couldn't lose her grandma. Vanessa shook her shoulder.
"Grandma!"
Nothing. Fear seized her. She had to do something. Get help. Vanessa ran for Grandma's phone. Her hands shook as she pressed 911.
"Please help," she cried. "My grandma passed out. She's on the floor." "Where are you, honey?" the 911 operator asked. Vanessa spit out their address between sobs.
"I'll have someone stand guard by your room while I retrieve those files," Ian said.
"That's not necessary, Ian."
Beth clenched the sheet between her fingers.
"He won't take a chance by coming here, not with all the staff around."
Ian wasn't so sure, but they were short on manpower. "I'll alert security not to allow anyone in your room."
"Thanks."
Beth closed her eyes as if she couldn't keep them open any longer. Ian stroked her forehead. She needed rest, and the nurses would be monitoring her for the concussion. He hesitated, though. She could have been killed tonight, lost forever, all because he'd left her in the cave alone. But if he didn't find this unsub, the maniac would come back for her. Beth thought there were two of them. That complicated the case more. His fingers brushed her hair again, and need heated his blood. Unable to resist, he pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Get some rest, Beth. I'll be back, I promise." Her eyelids fluttered open for a moment, and their gazes locked. A spark of attraction he didn't want to feel ignited in his gut. Her eyes flared with recognition, as if she felt it too. Or maybe he'd imagined it. She was half asleep and injured. Fool. How could Beth feel anything for him after he'd let her down 15 years ago? That brutal reminder sent him toward the door. He stepped into the hall and explained to the nurse that he had to leave. She promised they'd keep a close eye on Beth, and he hurried to see his father. Damn it, his father looked exactly as he'd left him. Ashen-faced and comatose. What if he never regained consciousness? Machines beeped, blending with Ian's footsteps. He laid a hand on his father's arm. "Dad, I'm working hard to find the man who killed those girls." Beth finally remembered something. She says it's a father and son team. Emotions thickened his throat. Once, he and this man had been a team. He wanted that again. "I'm going after those files, and we'll prove your innocence." Although nothing could replace the 15 years of his life his father had lost. He stood for another few minutes, talking quietly, hoping that his father would hear his voice and that hope would help him heal. "Fight, Dad, fight," Ian said. Then he squeezed his father's hand and left. Just as he headed out the ER door, a car screeched up behind an ambulance. Coco's husband Dion and Vanessa jumped out. Both looked terrified. Vanessa was crying. Ian jogged toward them. "What happened?" Coco's husband wiped at his sweaty forehead. "Coco heard the Carson girl was dead and she collapsed." Vanessa sobbed against her grandfather while the medics unloaded Coco. Emotions flooded Ian. Coco was like a mother to everyone in Graveyard Falls, including him. She had to be all right. The town needed her. Tandy Pooler Benton buried herself deep in the covers of the bed she shared with her husband, cringing as the door to her house creaked open. He'd slipped out earlier, but he was home now. Her son's voice drifted through the door, and Tandy's heart broke. Her husband insisted it was time their son followed in his footsteps. Tandy disagreed, but her opinions didn't matter. The light flickered on in the living room, sending a faint stream beneath the door. Footsteps pounded as he walked across their living room floor, and the low hum of the gospel tune he sang echoed through the eaves of the old house. She shivered at the sound. He'd been at it again, saving another lost soul, exorcising the demons. At first she questioned his interest in the young girls at the revivals. She'd suspected he had a physical thing for them, that his own sin was lusting for the innocent. But he staunchly denied it. Not that she approved of how he handled bringing them to salvation, but she was his wife and he was her master. She had to obey. Questioning him was a sin in itself. More footsteps, then the light flicked off in the living room. Tandy closed her eyes tightly, struggling to control her breathing. Some nights after the girls, he came home all wired and demanding she service him like a wife was supposed to. Those nights he branched into dirty stuff that had shocked her in the beginning. Painful sex that left her hurting and wishing she'd never married. Other times he was so wrung out that he fell into bed and slept like the dead. Those were the nights she prayed for. The sounds of his zipper rasping rent the air, buttons unsnapping on his shirt, his pants sliding down. She'd long ago memorized every nuance of her husband's routine. She continued to pretend sleep, her eyes closed, forcing her breathing to remain steady, as he hung each garment up neatly. He slipped into the bathroom, and she prayed with all her might that he'd leave her alone tonight. The water turned on in the bathroom. The toilet flushed. The door opened again. Footsteps shuffled as he approached the bed. Instead of climbing in on his side, though, he stopped and stared down at her. Tears burned the backs of her eyelids, but she didn't dare move. His breathing rasped out, uneven and filling her with dread. He reached out and slid his hand around her neck. A sob caught in her throat, but she swallowed it. If she fought him or told him she was tired, she'd get the sermon again and the punishment.
"It was a rough night," he murmured as he crawled on top of her. "She was a fighter, but I saved her in the end."
Tandy choked back a cry of protest and spread her legs. Ian kept alert as he drove into the mountains. Anxiety thrummed through him as he passed the burial site where they'd first found the bodies. The scent of the blood from the cave lingered on his skin. Had the unsub already chosen another victim? Anger forced him to punch the accelerator. He couldn't waste time. He took the curve on 2 wheels, tires screeching, then sped up the gravel road. 3 miles down, he veered onto a narrow dirt road that led deeper into the hills. Thunder boomed and a streak of lightning zigzagged across the dark sky. The clouds opened up, and rain pounded the roof of the SUV, making him slow. He turned the wipers to full speed, tires grinding over gravel and mud. How had his father found this place? His father had been living on the run, probably hiding in caves and bushes and wherever he could. No telling what he'd eaten or how he'd survived. The GPS indicated Ian had arrived, and he slowed as a run-down shanty appeared. Ian pulled off the side and parked in front of the rotting structure. He scanned the area but saw nothing, no cars or signs that anyone was here. He yanked his jacket hood up over his head, pulled his weapon, and held it at the ready as he climbed out. He scanned the perimeter as he rushed up the rickety steps and peeked through the broken, muddy windows. No lights inside. He leaned his head to the door and listened. All was quiet. He jiggled the door and it swung open. He stepped inside and raked his hand along the wall to find a light switch, but when he flipped it, nothing happened. Using his flashlight, he crossed the room, the wood floors bowing beneath his weight. No lights in the kitchen either. Of course there wouldn't be. His father had been a criminal on the run. He hadn't any way to pay for electricity. Ian swung the flashlight in a wide arc and spotted a couple of tin cans that had held food, a ratty couch covered with a threadbare blanket, and a scarred wooden table. He checked the kitchen drawers in search of the files. Nothing but rusted flatware, mice droppings, and a can opener. Anger at the conditions his father had been forced to live in hit him again, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Where had his father stored those files? He waved the flashlight across the room again. A cardboard box sat on the bookshelf, so he hauled it down. A yearbook was also tucked inside with the files. He thumbed through the folders, noting the names of dozens of students. Beth could help him read through them faster. He searched the rest of the tiny cabin, his heart aching when he found a photograph of Coach and Ian's mother on the nightstand. All those years, his father must have felt so alone, must have felt betrayed. His phone buzzed as he hurried to his vehicle with the box. Peyton. He quickly connected.
Sheriff, I tried to call Beth, but she isn't answering. Director Vance said she's in the hospital.
She had an accident, but thankfully she didn't suffer any serious injuries, Ian said.
Good. I was worried about her.
So was he. Her boss is upset with her, isn't he?
That's putting it lightly, but you two did good work.
Peyton hesitated.
I may have found something helpful.
Hope spiked in Ian's chest. What?
When you sent me pictures of that art on the cave walls, it seemed familiar.
I thought so, but I couldn't place it.
I did some digging, Peyton said. The symbols and style are very similar to paintings done by an artist local to Graveyard Falls.
A memory tickled Ian's consciousness. Good God, I know who you're talking about. I saw him at the festival in town.
That's not all, Peyton said. When I reviewed the notes Agent Hamrick and Agent Coulter took when they interviewed the victims' families, at least 3 of them mentioned they'd received a painting after their loved one went missing.
A painting? You mean one with religious symbolism?
Yes. The note that accompanied the painting indicated it was a gift from a churchgoer who wanted to offer comfort.
Who sent the paintings?
They were anonymous, but I've called Agent Hamrick and Agent Coulter and asked them to follow up. I'm also securing photos of the local artist's work for comparison.
Ian pressed the accelerator. You think the unsub sent the victims' families a painting?
I don't know, Peyton said. But that artist in Graveyard Falls has a technique that sets his work apart from others.
What are you talking about?
He mixes human blood with the paint he uses in his pieces.
Chapter 30. Had the killer used his victim's blood in his artwork and then sent it to the families? Ian's mind raced. What kind of demented person did that? I'll talk to the artist, Ian told Peyton. Although it was the middle of the night and he needed a warrant. If there's anything to it, I'll let Director Vance know. Ian hung up, then phoned the local judge and requested a warrant. Do you have probable cause? The judge asked. More than a dozen girls have been murdered, Judge. The killer collects the girl's blood after he drains it. This artist uses human blood in paintings he sends to the victims' families. He hoped he was making his point. Do you want to give the unsub time to add another victim to the list? A big weighted sigh. Of course not. I'll issue the warrant. Ian ended the call, then phoned Deputy Whitehorse and explained the latest development. I'm still at the cave with CSU. It's going to take hours, maybe even days to process the place. I trust Lieutenant Ward to oversee it. You want me to pick up the artist for questioning? Whitehorse asked. Let's wait until we get the warrant. If we tip him off, he might run. Stake out his place. If he makes a move to kidnap another girl, we might catch him in the act. Ian disconnected and swung into the hospital parking lot. He carried the box of files into the hospital with him. Although the staff was watching Beth, he needed to see her in person. He passed through the waiting room. Vanessa was hunched in a chair, looking despondent. Her grandfather was snoring in a chair beside her. A few locals he recognized from the cafe had arrived to offer comfort. Another reminder of how the people in Graveyard Falls supported one another. His heart went out to Vanessa. First she'd lost her best friend, and now her grandmother was ill. She looked up at him with tear-stained eyes as he approached. How's Coco? Ian asked. Vanessa gulped.
She had a mild heart attack, but the doctor said she'll be okay.
That's good news, Ian said. Vanessa shrugged, unconvinced. He'd heard that her mother had abandoned her, and his heart gave another pang. She reminded him of Beth at that age. She tried to be tough, but she'd already suffered a lifetime of loss in the few years she'd been in this world. He ruffled her hair. Hang in there, Vanessa. Coco will be back bossing everyone around in no time. A tiny crack of a smile gave him hope that Vanessa would be okay. But the sadness returned to her eyes a moment later.
Did you find the man who killed Prissy?
His gut pinched. Not a question any 14-year-old should have to ask. Not yet, but we're getting close. He indicated the files. I'd better get back to it. Vanessa dropped her head back against the vinyl sofa as Ian hurried to Beth's room. He relieved the security guard, then entered the room, lightening his step. He didn't want to disturb her, but he had to touch her. Her skin felt warmer than it had before, a good sign. Her breathing was steady. He stroked her cheek with the pad of his thumb. We might finally have a lead, Beth. I promise I won't stop until we catch this guy. Except Beth had said there were 2, a father and son. Reverend Jim Benton and his father. He texted Peyton to dig up all she could on both the Bentons and the artist and his family. Ralph Lewis was his name. Ian settled in the corner of the room. His father had kept a file on each student he'd counseled, complete with notes on their conversations. A file labeled Jane Jones stirred his curiosity. His father had made notations regarding his concern over her foster father. Emotions thickened his throat. So his father had been trying to help her. He turned his focus to the remaining files. His pulse jumped when he discovered one for Ralph Lewis. Funny, but he didn't remember the guy. Not that he'd paid much attention to his younger classmates, and Lewis was a year younger. He flipped open the folder and skimmed. Lewis had been a good student, quiet but antisocial. He was not athletic, but he excelled at science. He was creative and enjoyed painting. Religious symbols filled the pages, along with drawings of angels. There were also macabre sketches of graveyards and bones. Ian bounced his leg up and down, his mind working. According to his father's notes, Lewis was obsessed with blood. At 15, he was experimenting with combining it with paint as an art medium. Lewis's mother had died when Ralph was an infant, leaving him to be raised by a single father, Hugh. Ian rubbed his temple. If they were dealing with a father-son team, Lewis's father might have murdered some of the girls. Then Ralph started killing as a teenager. If Ralph was in the truck that night, Beth might have felt it was safe to take a ride with him because she knew him from school. Ian searched the notes for more information on Lewis's father. Hugh Lewis was a truck driver who made deliveries up and down the southeast. Another notation indicated that Ralph and his father also followed the teachings of the Holy Waters, Benton's church. Ian shifted. They had to be connected. Morning sunlight spilled through the hospital room, rousing Beth from the nightmarish images of bones and ghosts. Claw-like broken pieces of skeletons had flown past her, along with skulls and hollow, empty eyes begging for help. Blood swirled and sprayed the air and her face, as if the bodies had exploded and their blood had erupted like a volcano. Her head ached as she opened her eyes. It took her a few seconds to realize she'd been dreaming. It had seemed so real. She glanced around the room. Ian had fallen asleep in the chair in the corner. His head was lolled to the side, his lips parted, his breathing puffing out as if he was exhausted. A box of files sat in front of him, one clenched in his hand. He looked big and awkward and uncomfortable, and so sexy that her heart fluttered. He'd probably worked all night while he guarded her to make sure she was safe. All that after she'd shot his father. She tossed the sheet aside and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She had to get back to work. A dizzy spell swept over her, and she gripped the bed with clammy hands to steady herself. "What the hell are you doing?" Ian's gruff voice made her jerk her head up. His tone had been harsh, but worry darkened his sleep-ridden eyes. "I need to get out of here." She indicated the file box. "Did you find something?" Ian scrubbed a hand over his face. His 5 o'clock shadow was morphing into heavy beard stubble this morning. He must be totally worn out. He stood and coaxed her to sit back. "I think so. Peyton phoned last night. That local artist who does the religious paintings is from Sweetwater. He went to school with us. His name is Ralph Lewis." Beth tried to recall his face. Ian waved the folder in his hands. "He saw my father for counseling. He was obsessed with blood as a teenager, and he uses blood in his paintings." His voice rose a notch. According to Agents Hamrick and Coulter, 3 of the victims' families received a painting with religious symbols similar to his work after their daughters disappeared. I'm getting a warrant to pick up Lewis and search his house, car, and studio. "My God, Ian. You think the paintings he sent the families contained their daughter's blood?" Ian grimaced. "We'll know once the paintings are tested." Beth had seen the vials of blood, seen a figure mixing blood with paint. The pieces fit. "Ralph's father was a trucker, Beth. He serviced the same route our killer did." "The father and son team," Beth whispered. Ian flipped the file to a photograph. "This is a picture of Ralph Lewis as a teenager. Do you recognize him?" Anxiety knotted Beth's shoulders. An hour ago, she was berating herself for not having the courage to identify her kidnapper years ago. Yet the thought of finally looking into his face triggered her old fears. Time to get over that. She reached for the file. Ian moved up beside the bed, his presence oddly comforting and disconcerting at the same time. "This is him, Ralph Lewis. He was 15 at the time." The high school picture launched her back in time. Ralph was skinny with frizzy reddish-brown hair and large ears. "Does he look familiar?" Ian asked. Beth focused on the details of the teenager's face. A long, crooked nose, muddy brown eyes. His face was tilted away from the camera, as if he was shy or didn't want his picture taken. He looked as harmless as a puppy. Could he have possibly been devious enough to lure May and then her and Sonny into that truck so his father could kill her? In school, he liked art and was a science geek, Ian said. Maybe you had a class with him? I didn't take art, but he was in my biology class. An image of him dissecting the frog surfaced. He enjoyed dissecting animals. He always wanted to do the cutting. He liked to watch the animal's guts spill out. And he talked about how the blood spray made artistic patterns. Ian's phone buzzed just as he picked up the warrants for the Lewis house and property. He sent Peyton a text. Need address for Lewis's father. Also a photo of what he looks like now, and what he looked like at the time of J.J. Jones and Sonny Smith's abduction. She responded. Copy that. Ian stood. I'm going to question Lewis. Beth tugged at the hospital gown. I'll go with you. Get my clothes. Ian shook his head. No, you need to rest. Beth pushed to her feet. You and I have worked this case far too long for me to lie in bed when it goes down. I can handle it, Beth. I know that, but I need to do this. The pain and determination in her voice ripped at Ian. How could he deny her when he'd do the same thing? All right, but only if the doctor releases you. And if you start feeling dizzy or weak, you have to let me know. Beth agreed, although he had no doubt that she'd fight through whatever discomfort she felt in order to lock up this unsub. It was his job to protect her. He buzzed for the nurse and left the room for Beth to get dressed. 15 minutes later, Ian climbed the winding highway and turned onto a dirt road that went uphill to the top of a ridge. Beth sucked in a breath. Are you sure you're up to this? He asked. She wiped a bead of perspiration from her forehead. I wouldn't miss it for anything. I sent Deputy Whitehorse to run surveillance on him last night. Branches and weeds scraped the sides of the SUV. Thick trees and hemlock shrouded the light, making it appear dark and shadowy. The SUV chugged over the ruts, slinging gravel as he maneuvered the sharp right turn. Ian passed Whitehorse where he'd parked in the woods and motioned for him to follow him to the house. Deputy Vance might be pissed that he'd taken initiative and brought Beth here, but if he and Beth and Whitehorse solved this case, the director would get over it. A battered pickup truck was parked beneath a makeshift garage. Ian expected to see a canoe, but he didn't find one. Of course, it could be in the back somewhere, or Lewis could have left it tied at the riverbank. The cabin looked small until he realized a covered walkway connected it to another space, which was probably the man's studio. Ian turned to Beth. You look like hell, Beth. You must be sore from the accident. Wait here. Deputy Whitehorse and I'll check out the house. I'm going too. The look on her face indicated arguing was pointless. Do you have your weapon or did you turn it in? No way I'd give it up. Vance knows I need it for protection. She reached for her holster. Let's go. A second later, the three of them headed toward the house together. Ian pointed toward the rear of the cabin. Deputy, cover the back in case he tries to run. Whitehorse nodded and crept to the right to guard the back. Ian gestured for Beth to stay behind him, then held his gun at the ready as they inched up the porch steps. Ian glanced through the windows. Simple furnishings, rustic, leather furniture, a round oak table. He didn't see Lewis. Was he in his studio? Ian raised his hand, knocked, and waited. Beth eased to the left and checked the other window. His bedroom, she mouthed. He motioned toward the adjoining section, and they eased down the walkway until they reached the door. Beth knocked this time, and he raised his gun, braced to fire if the man was armed. Footsteps could be heard inside. Ralph Lewis, open up. He pounded the door again. It's Sheriff Kimball and Special Agent Fields from the FBI. Footsteps again, more hurried. The wind whistled, sending a tree branch banging against the window of the building. The door opened, and Ralph Lewis rubbed a hand over his apron. An apron streaked with blood. Chapter 31. A memory struck Beth as she stared at the blood on Ralph Lewis's shirt. Ralph in biology class dissecting the frog, then the pig. the odd smile on his face as he studied the blood on his fingers. Then he'd drawn a design of the spatter on a piece of notebook paper. It had chilled her to the bone. She scrutinized his features, hoping to put his face at the cave as he killed Sonny.
"What's this about, Sheriff?"
Lewis asked. "The Boneyard murders." Ian lifted the envelope in his hand. "We have warrants to search the premises and your vehicle." Lewis's eyes widened in shock.
"What are you talking about? I haven't done anything wrong."
"You sent gifts to the victims' families, didn't you?" He shook his head.
"No. Why would you think that?"
"Some of the families received paintings that are similar to your style," Ian said curtly. A nervous tic started at the corner of the man's mouth.
"You mean someone is copying my work?"
Ian shouldered his way into the house and gestured for Deputy Whitehorse to begin the search. Beth struggled to recall details of her abduction, how the man's voice sounded. Was it gruff, deep, high-pitched? Did he have an accent? And what about the boy? Canvases lined the wall. There were macabre renditions of Bones and the graveyard, along with several paintings of a garden with angels overlooking lush fields of grass, red roses, tulips, lilies, and violets. One featured a rose garden with dark reds and shades of pink, the same shades as the paint on Lewis's apron. Her heart thumped wildly. Was it painted with blood? More specifically, Prissy Carson's blood? Ian's gut instincts nagged at him. Ralph Lewis did not look tough. His body was soft, his face colorless, his voice weak. Beth said the Boneyard killer was probably someone who appeared non-threatening. The pieces fit. Ralph Lewis's father was a truck driver. He belonged to the Holy Waters Church. Ralph had been troubled as a teen, painted scenes of bones and graveyards, and his paintings focused on religious symbols. He also used blood in his artwork. Although the painting on the canvas wasn't creepy at all, it was almost ethereal. Ian hadn't seen the paintings the families received. Did Lewis create something beautiful from the girl's blood as some kind of symbol to imply that he'd sent the girls to a better place?
"What do you think you're going to find here?"
Lewis chased after Beth, then moved in front of her as she reached a hand toward the paintings.
"Don't touch it. The paint isn't dry yet."
"Mr. Lewis, take a seat and let us do our jobs," Ian said as Beth disappeared into another room.
"This is crazy," Lewis protested. "Why would you think I had something to do with a murder?"
Ian gestured at the man's stained shirt. "You have blood on you?" Lewis glanced down at his shirt.
"Yes, it's mixed with paint. It's one medium I use. But it's my blood, not someone else's."
Ian's brow lifted. "Really? So I won't find DNA from any of the victims in the paint?"
"No!"
The man shook his head vehemently. Beth returned, her gloved hand holding a vial of blood.
"There's a refrigerator in back with dozens of these stored inside," Beth said.
"It's all mine. I've been saving it for months."
Lewis wiped his hand on his apron.
"It's what makes my work unique. I literally put myself into every piece. It's my signature."
Ian's gaze met Beth's. Serial killers had signatures. "Call Ward to collect them and have them tested," Ian said.
"You can't take my blood," Lewis snapped. "I need it for my work. I have a showing in 2 weeks."
Beth used a calm tone.
"If you're innocent, Mr. Lewis, let us run a couple of tests to exclude you as a suspect. I'll make certain your work isn't damaged."
Lewis staggered backward.
"I'm calling a lawyer."
Ian gestured to the phone. Guilty men needed lawyers. Beth had hoped for details to rush back when she faced Sonny's killer, but that hadn't happened. Lieutenant Ward arrived with his team to process the house and collect the blood vials. Agents Hamrick and Coulter were transporting the art from the victims' families to the lab for comparison. One CSI concentrated on Lewis's computer, studying his history and social media sites. 2 others went to the main house to search. If they found references to the cave or pictures the man had taken of the victims, it would help cement the case. A confession would be better, but she didn't expect one, not unless they discovered concrete evidence to use to coerce him. Like the murder weapon, or something that led to the cave, or the victim's blood. Footsteps clattered and Lieutenant Ward appeared, his expression grim. There's something you should see. Ian gestured to Whitehorse to watch Lewis. Did you find the murder weapon? Beth asked. No, Ward replied. But look at this. With gloved hands, he picked up a black book and opened it. Lewis had assembled a list of prayers along with photos of his artwork. The last page in the book held several pictures of the boneyard. Ward had also found more paintings, before and after of the graveyard at Hemlock Holler. Before the tornado had struck, green grass and wildflowers dotted the holler. Another painting depicted the eerie way it looked with the graves uprooted. Bones jutted through the dirt and floated in the floodwater, the thin white gowns shimmering in the moonlight. The third painting was disturbing in a different way. He'd painted a graveyard in the holler, but this time the mounds of dirt held headstones with names on them. Retha Allen, Hillary Trenton, Sonny Smith. There were more graves scattered throughout, several unnamed. Were they for future victims? Frustration filled Ian. Those damn paintings were graphic and disturbing, but they hadn't found any definitive proof that Lewis was the unsub. He'd counted on the man keeping pictures of the victims, some kind of journal describing the kills, articles about the missing girls or about Sonny and Beth, a painting of the cave. None of that was here. The blood vials might be the key. He needed to hold the man until the tests were run. He didn't want to chance giving Lewis time to escape, or to grab another victim. Ralph Lewis, you are under arrest. He yanked the man's arms behind him and handcuffed him. You can't do this, Lewis said, his voice filled with panic. I can and I am. Ian pushed him toward the door, reciting his rights as they walked. Whitehorse appeared, his jaw set. You want me to take him in? Yes, Ian said. Agent Fields and I are going to track down his father. By the time we return, maybe he'll be ready to talk. Or they'd have the proof they needed for an indictment. Let me know as soon as the lab analyzes the forensics from the cave and whatever you find here, Ian told Ward. Ward agreed, and Ian turned to Beth. You look exhausted. Do you want me to drive you back to your cabin to rest? No, Beth said as she headed to the door. I need to see the elder Mr. Lewis. Maybe I'll recognize his voice or remember him. She laid her head against the seat and fell asleep as he drove. Ian's heart squeezed at the strain on her beautiful face. She needed to be at home, tucked in bed, safe and sound, away from the monsters who had robbed years of her life. Instead, she was charging ahead full speed. Affection for her mushroomed inside his chest. Today, with her hair in a ponytail, she looked so much like the young girl he'd known from school that he wanted to give her back that time. If he could rewind the clock, he'd insist his father let him take the car. All of their lives would have been different if he had. Ian veered onto a road that led into the countryside, then swerved onto a narrower road and passed Reverend Jim Benton's church. Beside the holy waters, a cluster of homes had been built for followers to create a tight community. Reverend Jim Benton and his wife lived in the parsonage. Ian found the address for Lewis's father, pulled into the drive, and parked. A black pickup sat near the side of the house, the truck bed covered in a tarp. Hadn't a black pickup run Beth off the road? Ian's skin prickled. What if Hugh Lewis was working with his son Ralph, and he'd taken another victim? He could have hidden her in that truck bed. Beth roused and looked up at him, her eyes cloudy with sleep. We're at Hugh Lewis's. Ian gestured toward the truck bed and pulled his gun. Beth's eyes widened in understanding. Then she removed her weapon and slid from the vehicle. Chapter 32. Ian paused as he neared the pickup to listen for signs that someone was under the tarp. Animals skittered in the woods, and a dog barked from one of the neighboring houses, but nothing from the truck. A noise came from the left, and he jerked his head around, expecting to see Hugh Lewis. But it was only a trash can lid rolling across the yard. He motioned for Beth to keep an eye on the door. She signaled an understanding, and he tugged at the edge of the tarp covering the back of the truck. He held his breath as he peeled it back. The heavy plastic rattled, but no one was inside. A girl's backpack lay at the edge of the truck bed, a pink jacket wadded up in the corner. He pulled on gloves and picked up the bag, then examined the contents. If Lewis had kidnapped another girl, this bag might belong to her. Beth edged her way to the truck, relieved to see it was empty. Ralph Lewis was in custody. Maybe they could lock his father up as well before anyone else was hurt. She examined the front bumper and sides in search of dents or paint damage. A few scratches here and there, but nothing definitive indicating that this was the truck that had hit her. The front door of the house opened and a heavy-set man in overalls lumbered onto the porch. His face was round and craggy, his white hair shaggy, and a full beard covered his chin and hung to his chest. He adjusted a pair of wire-rimmed glasses on his nose. "What are you two doing on my property?" Beth's gaze swept over the man in search of a weapon, but he didn't appear to be armed. "I'm Special Agent Beth Fields with the FBI, and this is Sheriff Kimball from Graveyard Falls." The gold cross dangling on a chain around his neck glinted, but it was chunkier than the ones they'd found with the victims. "What you doing snooping around my truck?" Lewis growled. Ian lifted the backpack and jacket. "Who do these belong to?" Lewis strode down the steps, limping on his left foot. "I reckon it belongs to one of the kids in the neighborhood." "Why is it in your truck?" Beth asked.
Lewis ran his fingers through his beard.
"Sometimes the church borrows my truck to haul the kids to the farm to help gather crops."
"The children ride in the back of the truck?" Beth asked.
"Sure do. But listen, lady," Lewis said, "it's not on a main road. I grew up riding in my daddy's truck, and I turned out okay."
Beth bit back a retort as Ian took a step toward the house. "We'd like to come inside." Lewis covered his mouth on a cough.
"Wait just a dadgum minute. What is this about?"
Ian folded his arms. "We have your son in custody, Mr. Lewis. We have reason to believe he may have kidnapped and killed the girls we found in Hemlock Holler." Lewis jumped back as if Ian had physically punched him.
"Are you crazy?"
He coughed again.
"My son may be strange, but he wouldn't hurt a fly."
"Are you sure about that?" Beth said.
"Of course I am."
"Then you won't mind if we look around," Beth said. His eyes darted back and forth between them.
"Go ahead. You won't find anything that incriminates Ralph."
Beth motioned for Ian to start the search. "Go on. I want to talk to Mr. Lewis for a minute." She needed to study him, his voice, force the memories to return. Was Hugh Lewis the man who'd given her and Sonny that ride? Ian scanned the street before he entered Hugh Lewis's house. The entire neighborhood was built around that damn cultist church. His mother and Bernard lived 3 houses down from the Reverend. Maybe he should drop in on her when he was finished and tell her his father was innocent. First things first, find evidence to back up an arrest. His gaze swept across the interior of the small house. A crucifix hung above the fireplace. Paintings of Jesus, the Last Supper, and angels decorated the wall. A Bible lay open on a small table surrounded by white taper candles, the same type found with the bodies. Ian read the verse, Romans 3:25. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood, to be received by faith. Did Lewis believe the girls should shed their blood as a sacrifice to atone for their sins? He combed the kitchen in search of the murder weapon, the knife that the man used to kill the girls. He found a set of kitchen knives, but they were dull and there was no evidence of blood on them. The ME said the murder weapon was a hunting knife, but Ian didn't find one anywhere. More religious symbols covered the walls. 2 bedrooms held similar artwork. Men's clothes filled the closet, and another Bible lay on the nightstand beside the bed, open to Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve. Nothing incriminating in the room or bathroom. An antique iron bed covered in a rustic quilt. A pungent odor assaulted him, and he yanked down the covers. Blood. He snapped a picture and then opened the closet door. 3 boxes of candles were stacked inside along with an ancient trunk. Fear slithered through him. That trunk was big enough to hold a body. Ian slowly lifted the latch. Relief filled him. No body inside. But the contents were interesting. 2 girls' backpacks, a stuffed bear that looked ragged, as if it had been well loved, a purple headband, a tattered girl's gown. His jaw tightened. Had these things belonged to the victims? Snippets of being tied in that cave trickled through Beth's mind. The voice, no, 2 voices, one deeper than the other, one with more of a southern drawl. Beth decided to take the direct approach.
Mr. Lewis, do you remember me?
His bushy eyebrows climbed his forehead. Should I?
Think back 15 years.
His mouth grew pinched. 15 years ago. Was he stalling by answering her question with a question?
Yes. 2 girls were kidnapped in Sweetwater that year. A girl named J.J. Jones and another, Sonny Smith.
Recognition dawned in his eyes. I saw the story on the news. They found one of the girls, but seems like she lost her memory.
That's right. J.J. was found traumatized but alive, Beth said. Sonny Smith turned up in that graveyard of bones.
A frown deepened the lines around his eyes. That's terrible, but I don't see what it has to do with me. Ian appeared holding a purple headband. Finding a teenage girl's belongings in the man's house was a bad sign. Something was wrong. Guilt streaked the older man's eyes. That's not what you think it is. It's not a girl's headband? Ian asked bluntly.
Where did you get it?
Beth asked. The man clawed through his beard again. One of his fingers had been cut off. A girl at church must have left it in the truck.
Why did you keep it?
Disgusting scenarios bombarded Beth. Had he kept other items from the victims in addition to the blood? Or was the blood his son's version of a trophy? Lewis averted his gaze. Just hadn't got around to returning it. What about the blood on those sheets? Ian asked. Lewis muttered a low sound. I want to call a lawyer. Ian grunted. You're going to need one. The interrogation at the jail dragged on. Ian vacillated between frustration that they hadn't found sufficient evidence to prove the Lewis men were guilty, and hope that the crime lab would. Hugh Lewis, the father, called a lawyer he knew through the church, a man named Bill Hufsted. He showed up to represent both father and son. Ian and Beth pressed them for a confession. Both staunchly denied the kidnapping and murder charges. The son had no alibi for the night Prissy Carson died, but insisted he'd been alone in his studio painting. The father claimed he'd attended a revival service led by Reverend Benton.
Hugh Lewis has explained the presence of the items in his house and truck, Mr. Hufsted said. Unless you have evidence you haven't disclosed, you need to release these men.
Ian shook his head. As you know, they have to be arraigned first. Then we'll see about bail. By then, hopefully they'd have the forensics he needed to make the charges stick, and the judge would deny bail. Then the residents of Graveyard Falls would be safe again, and his father's name cleared. The senior Lewis leaned over and whispered something in his lawyer's ear. Hufsted nodded.
Reverend Benton will confirm Hugh Lewis's alibi.
How do we know Benton won't lie to cover for him? Beth asked.
For God's sake, he's a man of the cloth,
Hufsted said irritably. The unsub we've been looking for is a religious fanatic who believes he's saving the girls he murders, Ian pointed out. Ralph Lewis and his paintings fit that description. Hufsted rapped his knuckles on the table.
Sheriff, get me a list of the times and dates of death for each victim.
He gave the Lewis men a reassuring look.
They're looking for a serial killer. When we get those dates, you can figure out where you were during the times of death and provide your alibis.
He laid his business card on the table.
Meanwhile, Sheriff, Agent Fields, my clients are not to be interrogated without my presence. Do you understand?
Ian folded his arms. Yes, but know this. When I get the proof I need, they're both going down.
If you get proof,
Hufsted said, his tone challenging. The man insisted on accompanying his clients to the cells alongside Ian, then left. Deputy Whitehorse had stayed at the Lewis residence while the crime team processed it. Ian called Markham and asked him to canvass the people in Benton's neighborhood, with photos of the items they'd found. He wanted to know if those items belonged to church members or to kidnap victims. Fatigue lined Beth's face. He couldn't remember the last time they'd eaten, and neither had had any decent sleep since the bones were found. Come on, I'll drive you back to the cabin. More storm clouds rolled in as they went to his SUV. 10 minutes later, Ian drove by the diner and picked up 2 specials. As soon as Beth stepped inside her cabin, she removed her coat.
I have to get a shower, Ian. I feel grungy from the hospital.
I'll put the food in the oven to stay warm and run to my cabin and grab a shower, too. Beth disappeared into the bathroom and the shower kicked on. An image of Beth standing naked beneath the spray of water teased his mind. He wanted to join her, hold her, make sure she was safe, put a smile on her face and love her until she cried out his name in pleasure. His chest clenched. Damn it. She'd been injured and was exhausted. He had to control his libido. Beth needed rest, not for him to make an advance. But he couldn't shake her image from his mind as he hurried to his cabin and undressed. Vanessa huddled on the park bench behind the school. She'd been here for hours, sitting and thinking and crying and wishing that her best friend was alive and that her Grandma Coco was well. She couldn't go back to her house, not without her grandma there. In her mind, she could see Grandma Coco falling over at the table, hear her strangled breath. She'd been so scared. Those doctors said Grandma Coco was going to make it, but Vanessa didn't know what to believe. She wanted to stay by her grandma's side until she woke up, but Granddaddy Dion wouldn't let her. He could be a hard-ass sometimes, always talking about praying and doing what God wanted and being a good girl and forgiveness. He'd forced her to go to school, but she hadn't been able to stay there either, not with everyone talking about Prissy's murder. That stupid boy Blaine that Prissy liked, he was the reason Prissy was dead. Someone ought to make him pay. Granddaddy would say that was wrong, that she shouldn't hate or want revenge. But Vanessa figured she must be a hateful person or her own mama wouldn't have left her. She swiped at her eyes again. She'd cried so much her face was puffy, and her nose was sore from blowing it. Leaves rustled from the woods and she peered through the trees. The buses and cars had left hours ago, but the baseball team had a late practice on the field. Blaine was strutting around, laughing like he was some big shot. Prissy's death hadn't fazed him. Selfish prick. A shadow caught her eye and she stiffened. She didn't want to talk to anyone. She just wanted to be alone. "What are you doing here, Vanessa?" She heard footsteps behind her. Before she could turn to see who it was, he shoved a dark bag over her head. She tried to scream, but a cold hand covered her mouth and drowned out the sound. Chapter 33. Beth's body ached from the assault the night before, but the warm water felt heavenly. It would feel more blissful if Ian joined her. She closed her eyes as she ran the soapy loofah over her skin. Her body tingled as she imagined Ian's fingers replacing the loofah. She wanted him, beside her in bed, on top of her, touching her, loving her, making her feel alive and safe. Not just safe, though. Wanted, hopeful, as if she might actually have a future and not be a prisoner of her past. Not that she was totally inexperienced. In college, she'd fooled around, but it hadn't meant anything. She'd begun to think she was stunted, that she couldn't feel those giddy sexual feelings people talked about because of what had happened to her. But Ian had awakened sensations and desires she'd never anticipated. Desires she wanted to act on. She rinsed off, climbed out, and pulled on a long-sleeved t-shirt and jeans, then left her hair loose to dry. She was suddenly starving, and looking forward to seeing Ian. By the time she emerged from the bathroom, Ian stood in her kitchen looking freshly shaven and showered in clean clothes. His broad shoulders stretched the fabric of his button-down shirt, and his jeans hung low on his muscular hips. Working with a partner, especially Ian, stirred something inside her that had been dead for a long time. Actually, something that had never thrived because she'd been too afraid to trust anyone, too afraid to give herself to a man, at least emotionally. "It's just beef stew, but it's hot," Ian said as he set the food on the counter. "It smells delicious. Do you want a beer?" Beth asked as she pulled a bottle of white wine from the fridge. She rolled her neck. "After a night like last night and today, I could use a drink." "A beer would be great." He filled their bowls and they carried them and the drinks to the table. She'd expected it to be awkward, but he must have been as exhausted and hungry as she was, because he took a sip of his beer and dug in. She cleaned her bowl in minutes, then sat back and sipped the wine. "How's your dad?" His dark gaze rose to meet hers. "In a coma." Time will tell. Guilt once again mushroomed inside her.
I'm so sorry, Ian. It's my fault he went to jail. My fault he's in the hospital.
Much to her chagrin, tears filled her eyes.
Those girls, Prissy, the others, if I'd remembered sooner, they'd be alive, and you and your family might be together.
Ian had spent half his life being angry with Beth and the world for the upheaval to his family. His father's arrest had driven him to become a cop, to focus on solving crimes. It had also made him bitter. He was tired of being alone, and blaming the world, especially Beth. Good God, she'd been a victim in the worst kind of way, thrown away by her mother, forced into a system that hadn't taken care of her, abused by the people who should have protected her. Then she'd witnessed her best friend's murder. It was time for both of them to let go and live again. Beth pushed the heels of her hands against her eyes as if embarrassed by her display of emotions. Ian couldn't restrain himself any longer. He walked around the table and gently pulled her to stand. Beth, none of this was your fault.
I shot your father,
she said in a tortured whisper. He held a knife to your throat. I would have done the same thing if he hadn't released you. Her eyes searched his.
But he was driven by desperation. He never would have gone to prison if it wasn't for me.
Ian traced a finger along her jaw. No, Beth. He wouldn't have gone to jail if a serial killer hadn't kidnapped you and Sonny. If he hadn't had files that incriminated the real killer, files he probably didn't realize he had at the time that could prove his innocence.
He was a good man, and he suffered for it,
Beth said, her voice cracking. That's true. You were innocent too, and you suffered just as much. All the more reason we put this bastard, or this team of killers, away. Ian drew her to him. She felt small and fragile and so damn womanly that his body hardened, desire replacing the need to comfort.
I don't understand why the unsub let me go. I need to ask the Lewises that tomorrow.
Think about it, Beth. If his goal was to save sinners, maybe he decided you weren't a sinner. You were unselfish. You offered your life to save your friend. Maybe he realized that you deserved to live. Understanding dawned in Beth's eyes, and the pain diminished slightly.
I never thought about that. But it doesn't make it right. It's like he's playing God.
Ian leaned closer to her, their noses brushing. No, it's not right. But like you said in the profile, he thinks he's saving the girls. He stroked her cheek. We'll get him. We're close. I feel it. She lifted her hands to rest them on his arms. Their gazes locked. Heat simmered between them. Desire flamed as if someone had lit a match, and he lowered his head and closed his mouth over hers. Her lips met his, and he tasted sweetness and hunger and a need that rivaled his own. The flame grew hotter as he deepened the kiss, and she moved her body against him. Her breasts brushed his chest, and when her nipples beaded beneath the thin shirt, he realized she wasn't wearing a bra. Lust shot through his groin, and he trailed kisses along her neck and throat, eager to taste every inch of her. Beth's body hummed with pleasure as Ian slid his hand beneath her t-shirt. Her nipple beaded as his fingers stroked her sensitive nub, and she raked her hands over his back, urging him closer. He deepened the kiss, teasing and exploring, and she met his tongue thrust for thrust. A little voice inside her head warned her that making love to Ian was not a good idea. But her body ignored that voice. She ached for more of his hands and his mouth. He lowered his mouth and kissed her neck, nipping at her earlobe, and then he tugged her nipple into his mouth and suckled her. Titillating sensations rippled through her. Ian groaned and raked his hand over her hip. Beth clung to him, savoring the passion in his touch as his fingers danced across her skin. She wanted more, wanted to be skin to skin, naked in his arms. She coaxed him to the bedroom, yanking at his shirt as they kissed again. He lifted her t-shirt over her head, and cool air brushed her skin. Then his hands and mouth brushed her belly and breasts, inflaming her with desire. Hunger and need sparked to life as he eased her down on the bed, and she gave in to the moment and tugged at his belt. He yanked at her jeans at the same time. His hands were big but tender, his body hard yet giving as they stripped each other's clothes and he crawled above her. He gently stroked her hair from her cheek and searched her face. "Beth?" The hunger in his tone matched her own and made her body throb for his. "I want you," she whispered. He teased her neck with his mouth. "I want you too." The fire between them ignited, and he trailed his fingers over her skin again, loving both of her breasts. He tugged one taut nipple into his mouth, and she groaned and threaded her hands in his hair. He teased her other nipple with his fingers, his body moving against hers, and she stroked his calf with her foot. Instead of joining her, he trailed kisses down her abdomen until he found her sweet spot and ran his tongue along her tender folds. She cried out his name and tugged at his arms, lifting her hips in invitation. He took a second to roll on a condom, then nudged her legs apart and stroked her thighs with his sex. It was thick and long and throbbed against her. She moved against him, savoring the erotic sensations of his body melding with hers, sweet bliss filling her as he thrust inside her. Ian's body ached with the need for release, but he wanted to prolong the pleasure, for himself and for Beth. She'd been hurt so much, he'd do anything to keep her from being hurt again. He thrust deeper, her low moan of pleasure nearly driving him over the edge. He held on, though, determined to enjoy every minute of the ride. Her skin was soft, her touches sensual, her kisses so erotic that she was ruining him for another woman. She clawed at his back, gripping him tighter as he filled her, then pulled out and thrust inside her again. Passion built, sensation spiraled, and her whisper of need coaxed him into a frenetic rhythm that drove everything from his mind but making love to her. She met him thrust for thrust, his cock plunging deeper and deeper until she whispered his name, and her body spasmed around his. She clutched his hips, driving him to move faster and faster, until he couldn't hold back any longer. He groaned as he came inside her. Beth clung to him and he held her tightly, the past fading as the possibility of a future replaced the pain. Tandy tiptoed to the office door at the church where her husband had called a meeting of the deacons and elders. Something serious was going down, but as usual she was in the dark. The men in the church believed God meant for them to be the leaders. Women were subservient, put on earth to serve their husbands. She tried to remember a time when she'd had a mind of her own and hadn't been afraid to speak it. It was years ago, before she'd joined the church and taken her vows. Sometimes she missed that woman with the brains and the spunk. But that wasn't who she was now. As her mama used to say, "You make your bed, Tandy girl, you lie in it." Voices rumbled inside the room. Earlier, Jim had received a call from Hugh Lewis. That call had done something to her husband. He'd gone ashen-faced and reached for a drink. Jim only took to the whiskey after he'd saved one of the girls. He said the savings drained him, and that he needed sustenance, either in booze or in sex. She was grateful the nights he chose the whiskey. Jim's voice boomed through the doorway, and she leaned against it and listened. "The sheriff and that FBI agent have arrested Hugh Lewis and his son for the Boneyard murders." Shocked responses followed. "What are we going to do?" one of the deacons asked. "Do they have any evidence?" another man asked. Tandy gripped her stomach, trying to tamp down the bile. "I don't know what they have, but Lewis knows to keep his mouth shut about what we're doing here," Jim said. "No one speaks to the police about it. Do you understand?" Fear slithered through Tandy. Jim and the other men claimed they were doing God's will. She didn't agree. Every time she heard the girls crying and screaming, she wanted to intervene. She wanted to tell. But telling would mean she'd be punished. It wouldn't stop them. Nothing would. Beth curled into Ian's arms, warm and sated and already craving more. Exhaustion tugged at her limbs, but her mind relived each delicious second Ian had touched her. He stroked her arm with his fingers, a gentle soothing motion that finally relaxed her into sleep. She dreamed she was standing in a green field of wildflowers, with butterflies fluttering around while she and Ian exchanged wedding vows. The breeze ruffled his hair, making him look sexier than a man had a right to be. But it was the love in his eyes that warmed her body and soul. The sound of a phone buzzing jarred her from sleep. Beth opened her eyes, disoriented. She wasn't in a field of flowers, and she was cold. She raked her hand across the bed, but it was empty. Damn. The dream was just a dream. Ian's deep voice echoed from the bathroom. She slipped from bed, pulled on her bathrobe, and went to the door. It was the middle of the night. "Listen, Dion, have you tried her friends?" Ian asked. "What's wrong?" Beth whispered. Ian motioned for her to hang on. "How about the hospital?" A pause. "She's not there. Okay, I'll get my men looking for her right away," Ian said. "Call me if you hear from her or think of someplace she might have gone." He ended the call, worry flashing in his eyes. That was Vanessa's grandfather. Vanessa is missing. Chapter 34. Beth fidgeted with the belt to her robe. "Are you sure she's missing?" A muscle ticked in Ian's jaw. He grabbed his shirt and yanked it on. She wanted to stay at the hospital with Coco, but he thought it would be best if she went to school. He assumed she came home from school and fell asleep last night, but when he went home to change, her bed hadn't been slept in. Beth's pulse clamored. The poor young girl had suffered heartache over Prissy, and then she'd nearly lost her grandmother. "She's scared," Beth said, thinking out loud. "Her grandparents are all she has. Did he check with her friends?" "Yeah, the few she has." Ian pulled on his jeans and zipped them. Beth couldn't tear her gaze from the masculine movement. Just a short time ago, she'd been lying naked in his arms. She wanted to go back to that blissful place, not to think about another missing teenager. But she couldn't ignore the facts, so she quickly dressed. "Ian, what if she didn't just run off? What if we're wrong about the Lewises and the unsubs are out there? They could have Vanessa." Fear flashed Ian's face. "I'll issue an APB for her and get my deputy to search around town." He dropped a quick kiss on her cheek. "Stay here and rest." Beth pressed one hand to his jaw. "There's no way I could sleep knowing Vanessa is out there alone and scared. Or in the hands of a madman." Ian gave a quick nod, his expression worried. Then he ran his hand down her backside. "I'm sorry. I wanted to go back to bed with you and wake up with you in the morning." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Good. I was afraid you'd have regrets." "I think I'm supposed to say that to you." "Don't bother," Beth said softly. "It was too good to regret it." She could have sworn his cheeks flushed, but his phone buzzed again and he snatched it up. Knowing they had to look for Vanessa, she hurried into the bathroom and washed her face. Her cheeks looked pink from their love-making, her lips swollen from his kisses. Making love to Ian again had to wait. She grabbed her gun and holster. Vanessa was in trouble. She needed them. They'd failed Prissy Carson. They couldn't let Vanessa down. Ian gripped the phone with clammy hands. "It's Kimball." "This is Peyton. I figured Beth might be resting, but you'd want results from the forensics as soon as I got them." "What do you have?" "I ran a few of Lewis's blood vials, and the blood was his. The blood from the paintings Agents Hamrick and Coulter collected matches our Vic's. Lewis's fingerprints are not anywhere on the paintings either." Ian chewed over that information. "So Lewis didn't send the paintings to the families?" "Not unless he has another studio or blood collection that we don't know about." "He said using his blood was his signature. Was any of his blood in the paintings the families received?" "Not that the lab found." "What about the blood on Ralph Lewis's shirt?" "His own." "Shit. Did you find anything on those items confiscated from Hugh Lewis's truck?" "They belong to 3 teenagers who attend Benton's church. Your deputies verified it when they canvassed the parishioners." Peyton paused. "All 3 girls are alive and accounted for, although all 3 have been admitted to the ER over the past year." "What for?" "One was dehydration, another of a snake bite. The third had bruises on her body as well." Peyton made a sound of disgust. "All 3 also bore scars from rope burns on their wrists and ankles. Because of that, the doctors notified social services." "Something's going on in that church community." Ian jangled his keys as Beth pulled on her jacket and indicated she was ready to go.
Sounds like it, Peyton agreed. But the girls were taken for medical care by family members.
So the families did care about the girls. Maybe that's why they'd survived.
You think you could be wrong about the Lewis men? Peyton asked.
Ian didn't want to be wrong. He wanted this damn case closed. But he had to keep his mind open to the possibility that although the Lewises might be involved in something questionable, they weren't the unsubs. Which meant the killers, remained on the loose, and one or both of them might have Vanessa. By 6 in the morning, Deputy Whitehorse had commandeered Weller to organize a search party for Vanessa. Half the town had shown up to search. Beth's emotions ping-ponged between fear that they had the wrong men in custody and hope that Vanessa was simply upset and hiding out with a friend. By 8, she and Ian drove to the school to meet with the school principal and counselor.
I talked to Vanessa's grandfather, the counselor said. We made an announcement asking anyone who may have talked to or seen Vanessa to come to my office.
What about that kid Blaine Emerson? Beth said. Do you think he'd do something to her? Miss Anderson shrugged.
Blaine and his friends are snarky, but he's never been violent before. I talked to him after you left the other day, and he assured me he had no idea what happened to Prissy. He even seemed remorseful about what he'd done.
He should be. Tell us about Vanessa, Beth said. Her grandfather mentioned that she didn't have many friends.
She's shy, the counselor said. Her only real friend was Prissy, although I saw a junior, Milo, talking to her.
Milo? Beth asked.
Milo Kane. He's a loner, too. A genius with computers. He's seriously into gaming. He relates more to technology and science than to the other students.
He was the kid wearing the white coat she and Ian had seen at school the day they'd questioned students about Prissy. Can you ask him to come to the office? Ian asked. She nodded, then checked her computer for his class schedule.
I can't. He's absent today. Father called and said he has the flu.
Did Vanessa discuss personal problems with you? Beth asked. The young woman fidgeted.
You know I can't divulge our private conversations.
Does that mean you were counseling her? Ian asked. Indecision played across the woman's face.
I tried to convince her to join a teen support group, but she wasn't interested.
Ian cleared his throat. We saw her grandmother and Vanessa talking to Reverend Benton at the revival. Did she ever talk about that? A wary look crossed her face.
I probably shouldn't divulge this, but Vanessa said the preacher suggested performing an exorcism to purge the demon trying to possess Vanessa's soul.
Beth went rigid.
The demon? That's what she said.
Miss Anderson rolled her eyes.
I planned to talk to her grandmother about it, but Vanessa didn't want me to.
Beth's throat thickened with revulsion. She'd seen the senior Benton performing an exorcism, and it had terrified her. Was Reverend Benton killing the girls he deemed had failed to be purged of the demons? Every second that passed increased Ian's anxiety as he drove toward the Reverend's house. He relayed the information Peyton had passed along.
You think we have the wrong men in jail?
Beth asked. Ian grunted. I don't know, but we can't take any chances. Her soft sigh reminded him of the passionate night they'd shared. He wanted her again. His heartbeat stuttered. He'd never felt such a strong connection to a woman before. Was it his guilt over what had happened to her, or could there be something else? Was he falling in love with Beth? An image of the two of them, living together, sharing a house, building a family, teased him. He'd never imagined having a family of his own. Not since he'd lost his own years ago. He swung onto the street leading to the church and the parsonage. A young man and his wife were walking their dog, but she kept her head bent down, almost as if she feared the man. He'd seen his mother display similar behavior. His stomach clenched into a knot. Just what was going on in this church community? Was his mother afraid of Bernard? He pulled into Benton's drive and parked behind a black Cadillac. Beth opened the door and climbed out, her movements agitated. They rushed up to the door and he rang the doorbell. Seconds later, the door opened. Reverend Benton's wife, Tandy, stood on the other side, her arms wrapped around her waist. Dark circles beneath her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much the night before, and her chin quivered as if she wanted to say something but was too afraid. We need to speak to your husband, Ian said. Is he here? She jiggled her foot.
What do you need to see him about?
We just want to talk to him, Beth said calmly. Benton's wife lifted a shaky finger and pointed toward a door in the hallway that appeared to lead to a basement.
He won't like it if you go down there.
Ian gave her a cold look. He didn't give a fuck what the man liked. Beth gently touched her arm.
Mrs. Benton, is there something you'd like to tell us?
She fidgeted with the wooden cross around her neck. The details of the design were identical to the one his mother wore. Wooden, carved with flowers. They'd also found crosses with the bodies, except they were simple gold ones. Mrs. Benton cast her head down and murmured a no. Ian strode past her, adrenaline kicking in. Just as he reached for the doorknob, a scream filled the air. Beth's eyes widened in alarm, and she slid her gun from the holster. He yanked the door open and raced down the steps. Chapter 35. Gun drawn, Beth followed Ian down the steps. A low light hung from an overhead chain, centered over a table where a young girl lay tied to posts. Beth's breath caught. Not Vanessa.
Please stop,
the girl cried.
I'm not bad. You can't do this to me.
Move away from her, Beth said between gritted teeth. Ian inched up behind Beth. Out of the corner of her eye, the shiny metal of his gun glinted. You heard what she said, Reverend, Ian growled. A woman and man stood to the side, the woman crying in the man's arms as they watched. Had to be the teenager's parents. The girl jerked at the thick ropes. Her wrists and ankles were raw from fighting to free herself.
Help me, please help me.
Reverend Benton lifted his hands in surrender, his face stone cold. You have no right to come into my house with a gun. Beth's heart hardened.
And you have no right to tie this girl down and torture her.
I'm not torturing her, Benton said. And I have every right. I am the spiritual leader of our church, and am sanctioned to oversee my parishioners. Beth rushed to the girl and began to untie her wrists. The girl was sobbing openly, her body shaking, her eyes glazed and unfocused. Ian addressed the parents. How can you stand by and watch this man terrorize your child and do nothing? Our daughter is out of control, the father said, a mixture of anger and fear streaking his face. Reverend Benton knows how to handle adolescents like her. Beth wanted to slap the creep, but she shot him a venomous look instead as she desperately worked to free the girl. The teenager's eyes rolled back in her head, and then her body went limp. Beth felt for a pulse. Low and thready, but she had one. She punched 911 and asked for an ambulance.
Hurry, we have a teenage girl unconscious.
What did you do to her? Ian barked. The Reverend exchanged questioning looks with the couple. I was simply performing an exorcism.
An exorcism?
Beth said shrilly.
This girl is dehydrated. Did you drug her?
Everything I did was in the name of the Lord, Benton said. She was possessed by the devil. I was helping rid her of the demon so we could save her soul.
We would never let him hurt her,
the girl's mother cried. He was hurting her, Ian snarled. I'm charging all of you with child endangerment and abuse. A siren wailed and Beth rushed up the steps to meet the ambulance. Benton's wife was huddled by the door, as if she had no idea what to do. Beth bypassed her, greeted the paramedics, and showed them where to go. A mixture of sympathy and anger warred inside Beth, but she tempered her tone.
You knew what he was doing and stood by and did nothing?
The woman dropped her head forward, her body trembling.
He was the master, the prophet,
she said in a shaky voice.
It's my job as his wife to obey.
Beth fought rage at the man who'd browbeaten her into thinking like that, into not allowing her to be her own person.
I know you're frightened, but it's also your job as a human to protect children. Yet by doing nothing, you endangered that young girl's life.
The woman gave a humble nod but didn't look up. Mrs. Benton exhibited classic signs of spousal abuse. Even if it wasn't physical, Benton had obviously brainwashed her into thinking she was subservient to him. No telling what he might have done to her if she'd called the police.
One question,
Beth said quietly.
The Boneyard killer has murdered over a dozen girls. Is your husband the man we're looking for?
Finally, Mrs. Benton lifted her head. An icy chill swept over Beth at the desolate expression in her eyes.
I don't know,
she said in a low voice.
I honestly don't know. Reverend Jim Benton staunchly denied taking Vanessa.
Yes, I spoke with her and her grandmother at the revival. Vanessa was depressed over her friend's death, and I suggested counseling.
Ian paced the small interrogation room in back of the jail, determined to get the truth. Beth watched, her demeanor calm, although he sensed she was seething with rage at the man.
Just as you were counseling that girl in your basement? Ian asked. I was doing God's will, saving these young girls' souls so they could have a future devoted to helping others and fighting sin. I didn't feel Vanessa was possessed, just grieving.
He'd already spoken with the girl's parents, and they'd backed him up. Benton's wife refused to talk further. Ian claimed the chair across from the Reverend, his hands planted firmly, his face inches from the preacher's. Listen to me. If you stashed Vanessa someplace and planned to go back to her, tell me now. Saving her life could go a long way toward lessening your sentence. Although with multiple murders on the table, he was looking at death row. I'm a man of the cloth. I have told you the truth. Contempt flared in Benton's eyes. Badgering me won't change my answer. Because you're a bully, Beth said with derision. You bully the women in the church and teach the men to do the same. God made men to be the leaders, Reverend Benton said with a feral gleam in his eyes. It is His will. He folded his hands in prayer fashion. But I will pray for Vanessa and her grandmother. I'll also pray that you find the person responsible for these heinous murders. Ian barely resisted punching the man as Benton bowed his head and launched into a prayer. Damn it, they were getting nowhere. Frustrated, he locked the man in a cell, and he and Beth drove back to the church neighborhood. They spent half the afternoon questioning neighbors and church members. When he reached his mother's house, he paused, his nerves on edge. He hadn't seen her in so long that emotions crowded his throat. He had a job to do, and by God, Vanessa's life depended on him doing it. Stay by the car and keep an eye out for anything suspicious, Ian told Beth. I need to talk to my mother alone. Beth squeezed his arm. Ian squared his shoulders and walked to the door. He knocked, surveying the property for Bernie. Thankfully, he didn't see him, and the man's car wasn't in the drive. Everyone they'd talked to in the neighborhood had sung Reverend Benton's praises. A pattern had emerged, though. The wives remained silent, obedient, in the shadow of their husbands. It was surreal, as if he'd walked into another time. When no one answered, he pounded on the door. He didn't intend to let his mother ignore him. If Bernie was home and tried to stop him from talking to her, he'd find some reason to haul the bastard in. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, obscuring the sun and making the wind feel colder than it should be. Footsteps clattered inside, and then someone pushed the front curtain aside and peeked out. His patience was about gone. It's me, Mother. Open the door, please. The curtain slid back into place. More footsteps. Finally, the door opened a crack. His mother's face appeared, although she looked gaunt. Her cheeks were sunken, eyes dark, skin sallow. Mother? Go away, Ian. My husband doesn't want you here. She sounded terrified. What about you, Mother? Don't you want to see your own son? She bit down on her lip, regret mingling with fear on her face. We have nothing to talk about. Yes, we do. You're my mother and I love you. She started to shut the door, but he caught it with his hand. Are you all right? Are you ill? I'm fine, she said in a meek voice. What was she hiding? Bruises? Was the man beating her? Ian wedged his foot into the doorway and pushed it open. We need to talk. What has he done to you? His mother lifted a frail hand to her cheek and then brushed at her hair, which she'd let grow long. It was graying and she'd secured it with a scarf. He takes care of me, Ian. Now say what you came to say and leave before he returns. Ian inhaled sharply. Dad is innocent, Mother. She shook her head, her expression tired. We've been through this. No, I mean he's innocent. I have proof. But he's in the hospital now in a coma. She fidgeted with her scarf but said nothing. I believe Reverend Jim Benton may be involved in the Boneyard murders and Jane Jones's kidnapping, Ian said gruffly.
Crime workers are searching Benton's house now for evidence. His mother gaped at him in shock. You're wrong. He's a good man. He had a girl tied in his basement, Ian said. They've taken her to the hospital. He saves souls over there, his mother said. You knew about the exorcisms? You condone his behavior? He asked, incredulous. She gave a small shrug. It's part of our church culture. God wants Reverend Benton to save teenage girls before they become lost as adolescents. Ian ground his molars. The killer we're looking for believes he's saving the girls' souls, Mother. Panic flickered in her eyes for a brief second before she masked it. Leave, Ian. Please, just let me be in peace. Sadness flooded Ian. His mother was broken. He should have realized that sooner. His father's arrest and trial had taken its toll, and made her weak enough to succumb first to Bernie and now to this preacher who'd swept in like some savior. They'd stolen what was left of the fight in her, not that she'd had much. She'd given up on his father too easily. But she was his mother, and he loved her. He'd do whatever he could to save her from this cult and the man who'd dragged her into it. The afternoon passed in a dreary blur. Rain set in, compounding the search efforts. Vanessa wasn't at the cave or any other place they'd checked. A despondent feeling swept over Beth. They'd failed Prissy. What if they didn't find Vanessa in time? The crime team found more girls' clothing and items in Benton's basement. Ian called a meeting of the church community, and parents identified their daughters' personal items. They didn't belong to any of the victims buried at Hemlock Holler. She rolled her hands into fists. How archaic a group to punish the females for the sins of the world. The child abuse and endangerment charges would stick, although they had no proof that Benton was a killer. He'd already consulted with a lawyer. Michaels had gotten wind of the arrests, had gone to the sheriff's office, and was running with a story about church corruption. Ian had actually given Michaels that angle to distract him while they continued the search for Vanessa. As evening fell again, desperation clawed at her. Vanessa's grandfather called, frantic. The poor man was distraught and wanted his granddaughter back. He wanted answers. Answers they didn't have. Vanessa stirred, her shoulders and body aching. She blinked, trying to orient herself. Grandma Coco was in the hospital. Her grandpa had dropped her off at school. She hadn't stayed, though. She'd run to the bench at the park behind the school and cried her heart out. Then she'd heard a noise. She tried to move, but her hands were tied behind her back and her feet were bound at the ankles. Fear choked her. Someone had put a bag over her head. Then she was smothering, and then she'd passed out. She glanced around the dark room. It was a room, wasn't it? It was so freaking cold. The sound of water dripping made her shiver. Something smelled bad. A dead animal? She remembered the story on the news, the story about Prissy being killed and those other bodies in the holler, and she gagged. Was she going to end up like that? Nausea cramped her stomach. Her mouth was so dry she could barely swallow. Something tickled her leg. A spider. She shook it off with a squeal. Help! Someone please help me! Her voice boomeranged back as if she was in a tunnel. Tears slid down her cheeks. They'd said Grandma Coco was going to be okay. But what would happen if Grandma came to and found out Vanessa was missing? She struggled with the ropes behind her back, determined to pull them free, but they wouldn't budge. Desperate, she raked her hand over the floor to search for a knife or a piece of broken glass or a sharp rock, something to cut the ropes. She didn't want to end up like Prissy. Footsteps sounded in the dark. The whisper of a voice. A door screeched open, letting in a tiny sliver of light. Shh. Don't cry, Vanessa. She froze in shock at the voice. She knew him. She'd trusted him. But he was going to kill her just like he had Prissy. Chapter 36. There was no way Beth could sit in the cabin and do nothing. She paced the task force meeting room while Ian talked to Vanessa's grandfather. She checked the boards, noting the details, dates, times of deaths, locations of victims' homes. The identity of the girl who died 30 years ago was still unknown. Could she be the key to the unsub's identity? Rather, the unsub's identities? She studied Reverend Benton's photo along with his father's picture. Reverend Wally Benton was familiar and set her nerves on edge. But it wasn't his face in that truck, was it? Next, she examined the photos of Ralph Lewis and his father, Hugh. She'd healed a lot in 15 years, and she wasn't that terrified child anymore. She had been trained as an agent, so why couldn't she see her abductor's face? If he was one of these men on the wall, why didn't she recognize him? She'd looked into Reverend Jim Benton's eyes earlier, but nothing had clicked into place. Because none of these men were guilty? She spread Coach Gleason's files on the conference table and sorted through them, quickly skimming the names. Ralph Lewis had attended school with her, Sonny, and Ian. But if he wasn't the killer and the Reverend wasn't, then they were missing something. She flipped through Sheriff Heedler's notes. He'd asked the students about her and Sonny. He'd also questioned students about Kelly Cousins. Something that looked like coffee had spilled on the page, blurring the writing, and she couldn't read the interview. She phoned Heedler. Who suggested that Kelly Cousins and Coach Gleason were having an illicit relationship?
Several of the students, Sheriff Heedler said.
Does anyone specifically stick out in your mind?
It was a long time ago, Agent Fields.
I'm aware of that, but this is important. Think, damn it. A tense pause, then a low breath.
Well, one kid was insistent. He seemed disgusted by the whole thing.
What do you mean?
He said the coach shouldn't be looking at young girls. Talked about how sinful it was, that someone needed to save them from men like him.
Chill bumps skated up her arms. What was his name?
Some religious name. Something like Abel. No, Cain. Last name was Cain. Abram was his first name.
The name Cain struck a bell. She'd seen it somewhere. Beth checked the notes on the students they'd interviewed at Graveyard Falls. The boy who'd dissed Prissy, Blaine Emerson, the other students who'd been a party to that nasty prank, and others who'd witnessed it. No Abel or Abram, but the counselor had mentioned a boy named Milo Cain. Milo was the boy in the white coat she'd seen talking to Vanessa. What if he was related to Abram Cain? Did Milo know where Vanessa was? She thanked the sheriff, retrieved the yearbook from her high school, and searched for a photo of Abram. The moment she saw his face, the room spun into a dizzying blur. Ian tried to calm Vanessa's grandfather, but the man was pacing the hospital waiting room. Unfortunately, Dion had reason to worry.
Coco is awake, asking for me and Vanessa.
His age-spotted hand shook as he pulled at his chin.
If I tell her Vanessa's missing, she might have another heart attack.
Ian swallowed hard. The man was right. He wished to hell he had good news. Tell her she's with a friend, that she didn't sleep last night and you insisted she rest. The man sucked in a breath.
Coco and I have been married nearly 40 years. I've never lied to her before.
We'll find Vanessa, Ian said, although he hated to make promises he might not deliver on. But maybe Beth would find something they'd missed. She'd insisted on returning to the task force room and reviewing all their notes.
I pray you're right.
Vanessa's grandfather's shoulders were slumped, though, the worry radiating from him a palpable force. Ian gave the man's shoulder a pat. I'll keep you posted. Let me talk to Beth and see if there are any new developments. Dion headed back to Coco, and Ian hurried to the morgue to meet Beth. When he entered the task force meeting room, Beth was leaning over the table, one hand rubbing her forehead. The concussion must be worse than he thought. He rushed to her. Beth, are you okay? A glazed expression muddied her face. What's wrong? He asked. Beth blinked several times, then seemed to regain her focus. I've been studying Heedler's files as well as your father's. She picked up the yearbook from the floor. The last name of one of the students Heedler interviewed rang a bell. A guy named Cain. Ian narrowed his eyes. Cain. That's the blood bank guy's last name. She nodded and flipped the yearbook to show him a photo. That's him, Abram Cain. He went to school with us, too. I didn't realize he attended our school. Abram first pointed the finger at Coach Gleason. Heedler said the teen was upset about Kelly Cousins and implied that Coach was being inappropriate with her. He's the reason the sheriff focused on your dad as a suspect. She hesitated.
When I saw him that day at the school, I felt panicky. I thought the blood was the trigger. But when I saw his photo in the yearbook, the same thing happened.
You think Abram Cain framed Dad because he had something to do with Kelly Cousins' death? Ian asked.
Maybe.
Beth rubbed her temple again.
There's more, Ian. He used to live next door to the Otters. His father was a trucker and a follower of the Holy Waters Church.
Her words made him stiffen. A trucker, another Benton follower, and he knew the Otters. Too many coincidences. So he could have known what was going on at the Otters' house? Beth nodded.
If we're dealing with a father-son team, Abram's father could have killed the girl who died 30 years ago. Then he kept on killing. Maybe Abram watched or helped him with Kelly. Now he's the one supposedly saving the girls.
My God, you think this has gone back generations?
It's possible.
Beth released a pent-up breath.
There's another connection. Abram Cain has a son named Milo. He's the boy Vanessa was talking to when we were at the school.
The timing was right. Vanessa would have trusted Milo. He could have lured her to go with him. And if his father was the boneyard killer, she'd walked into a trap. Director Vance had been pinging Beth all day. He was furious she hadn't followed orders. She decided to hold off responding until she had something concrete to tell him. Do you remember Abram's face from the cave? Ian asked.
Yes. He was in the truck with May.
Now that she remembered his face, more and more details were sifting through her consciousness. He'd read Bible stories to her and Sonny the first night, had read passages about evil and redemption. Ian gripped his phone. I'll call and get a warrant. Beth threw her purse over her shoulder.
Let's go. I have Abram Cain's address. He lives in the same neighborhood as Benton.
As they left, they picked up the warrant. 10 minutes later, Ian sped into Cain's neighborhood. He parked at a gray wood house a few houses from his mother's. The driveway was empty, suggesting no one was home. They pulled their weapons, jumped out, and approached the house. Beth scanned the surrounding area and spotted an outbuilding with a padded lock. Were the Cains holding Vanessa inside? If so, how had they managed to do so without a neighbor either seeing or hearing what was going on? Ian retrieved a crowbar from the back of his SUV and jogged toward the building. Beth stood watch in case the Cains returned while he pried the door open. Ian shined a flashlight across the dark interior. Shelves lined the walls, but they were empty. So was the room. If something had been here, Cain had moved it. Beth crossed the room, searching for anything that might indicate what Cain had stored inside, but the room had been cleaned out and smelled of bleach. Let's check the house. Ian strode out the door and Beth followed. The Cains had probably seen the police canvassing the neighborhood, gotten spooked, and run. They hurried toward the house anyway. Ian scanned the kitchen as he entered, listening for any signs indicating someone was inside. The kitchen appeared spotless and smelled like pine sol and bleach, just as the outbuilding had. Either Abram Cain was their unsub and had cleaned to get rid of evidence, or he was OCD about cleanliness. The fact that he'd lived next door to Beth as a teen, and that he'd created suspicion about Ian's father, was too coincidental to ignore. Abram's infatuation with collecting blood from the victims fit with his job at the blood bank. Working at the blood bank also fit with the profile of the unsub believing he was saving people. Beth had seen images of blood vials in her memories. Ian opened the cabinet doors and refrigerator in search of the vials, but found only dishes and a neatly organized refrigerator holding basic food items. Beth searched the pantry. Canned goods, no blood. Clear. Shoulders nodded, Ian moved to the den. A staircase led to the second floor. Beth gestured that she was going up. He spotted a door in the hallway and pointed to it. A basement would be a good place to hide a girl. Or a body. He turned the doorknob, then stuck his head inside and paused to listen. Nothing but the windows rattling from the wind. He shined the flashlight along the stairs and inched down them, gun at the ready in case Abram or his son was hiding out. But the basement was empty as well. He climbed the steps and heard Beth calling his name. Hope surfaced as he jogged to the second floor. He found Beth in a room he assumed was Milo's. Sci-fi posters adorned the walls, along with disturbing drawings of supernatural creatures and monsters. Beth was sitting at the boy's desk, her expression haunted.
He scanned the room for blood. Did you find something?
Maybe. Look at these.
She pivoted to show him the computer screen.
It's that Deathscape game that all the teens are playing,
Beth said.
It was all over Prissy's computer.
Beth clicked a few keys, and an avatar of a young girl encountered several doors, each labeled with a temptation. The theme appeared to be sin and punishment for those sins.
Milo didn't just play this game,
Beth said.
Remember the counselor said he was a genius. He invented it.
He gestured toward the young girl who lay on the floor, her eyes wide as she studied him. She is a sinner, son. It is your time.
But, Father, I am saving her in my own way.
Impatience blended with the need to make this as quick and painless as possible. He did not enjoy the suffering, but sinners had to be punished. I understand your need to reinvent our methods, he said. That is the reason I study the blood. One day I'll figure out a way to purge the bad blood and replace it with untainted blood. But for now, we follow tradition. He placed the knife in his son's hands. The young girl fought and tugged at her bindings, her sob for help bouncing off the walls of his cavern. Only no one knew where she was. She could scream at the top of her lungs, and no one would hear. Chapter 37. Milo Kane had designed Deathscape, and he was only a teenager, a scary indicator of his future. He fit the profile. He was awkward in social situations, didn't have many friends, was raised with strict beliefs under the umbrella of the Holy Waters Church, and he was detail-oriented. Had he invented his own method of researching potential victims? Was his father grooming him to become a serial killer? If we're right and the Kanes are responsible, Ian said, we need to find them fast. He called Peyton for information on what kind of vehicle the father drove, then had her issue a bolo. Beth seemed entranced by the game.
The punishments for sin in the game are horrific, each taken from the Bible. Stoning, brick and mortar, floods, snakes, plagues.
Is there a clue to where he's taking the victims in the game? Ian asked. Beth tapped the keyboard.
I'm looking.
Okay, I'll search the rest of the house. Ian rummaged through Milo's closet and found another book of graphic sketches. The boy was a meticulous artist, his renditions of biblical figures, demons, and the devil disturbing. Ian searched for a key to another house or storage building. Nothing. Damn it. The clock was ticking. In Abram's room he found work uniforms and casual clothing, but nothing with blood on it. A bookcase was filled with medical journals and research articles on blood disorders. He discovered a shoebox and opened it, hoping to find a trophy. A stack of envelopes was tucked inside. He quickly thumbed through them and noted the return addresses. They were from medical schools across the country. All rejections dating back 10 years. Ian clutched the box in one hand and went to tell Beth. Abram Kane wanted to attend med school. He was hoping to find a cure for mental illness through blood, but he was repeatedly rejected. Beth frowned.
That may be the reason he started keeping the girl's blood, so he could study it.
What about the artwork the unsub sends the victims?
Maybe his way of giving them back part of their daughters.
She gestured to the copy of the game in her hand.
I think he took some of the blood vials to a place he could use as a lab. In the video game, there's a sterile underground building.
Ian's mind raced. The cave we found was far from sterile.
I know, but this is the son's version. Since we exposed the cave, maybe he took Vanessa to the lab.
Beth continued to view the game.
Ian, call Peyton and find out if there's an old abandoned laboratory in the mountains near here or outside Knoxville.
Ian tapped his boot up and down on the floor while he made the call. He quickly told her what they needed, then heard keys tapping as Peyton ran a search.
Actually, a research company was housed not far from Knoxville, but the company went belly up, Peyton said. I'm sending you the GPS coordinates for its location.
Thanks. Seconds later, with the location in hand, he and Beth rushed to his SUV. His phone buzzed. Peyton again. He quickly connected. Yeah.
Ian, we have blood work results from the cave. We may have DNA from the killer.
Her voice sounded odd. Something was wrong. Who does it belong to? A tense pause.
The blood matched someone in our system.
He veered around a curve. Who is it, damn it?
Actually, there are two familial matches. One is to the Cain man, Abram. His father's blood is not in the system. Abram's father actually died a while back.
You said two. Who else? A deep sigh.
I probably should tell Beth this first, but I don't know what to make of it. That's why I called you.
What the hell? Just spill it, Peyton. Peyton sighed.
It was a familial match to Beth. I mean, to J.J. Jones.
Beth struggled to tamp down her panic as Ian flew around the mountain and then onto the highway toward Knoxville. As he hung up the phone, he gave her an odd look.
What is it?
She asked. A muscle ticked in his jaw. We'll talk about it later.
No, tell me now, Beth said. Is it Vanessa? Did they find her?
If Vanessa died, she'd never forgive herself. No. Beth grabbed his arm.
What's wrong, Ian?
He swung to the left and careened around another car.
Ian, please talk to me,
Beth said softly. He exhaled, his look dark. Peyton has results on DNA and blood from the cave. Blood they think belongs to the unsub.
That's good news, Beth said. Is it Abram Cain's?
There is a familial match to him, Ian said through gritted teeth.
Then we can use it against him, Beth said. This is the evidence we needed.
There was also a familial match to someone else. Someone in our system. Beth twisted her hands together.
Who?
Tense seconds passed. She thought he wasn't going to answer. When he did, Ian's voice grew low. To you, Beth. The familial match is to you. Shock waves rolled through Beth.
What are you talking about? There's got to be a mistake.
Ian's sharp look cut her to the bone. Forensics don't lie, Beth. People do. Hurt engulfed Beth.
You think I'm lying?
I didn't say that, Ian snapped. But it's odd that the killer turns out to be related to you, yet you forgot his face.
Because I was traumatized, Beth said. I told you I don't have any family. My mother gave me away when I was an infant. I never even knew my father's name.
Maybe you didn't know, Ian said, torn by the hurt in her voice. But he could have found you. He could have moved next door to Otter to watch you. Beth wrapped her arms around herself as if she might fall apart.
You can't think that I knew or that I'd cover for him,
she said in a strained tone. He didn't know what to think. Maybe he told you when he abducted you and you repressed that memory. He gripped the steering wheel as a truck barreled around them. He careened around the turn on 2 wheels. We'll discuss it later. He pointed to a white van ahead and the top of a steel building that looked as if it had been built underground. The plant had been some kind of solar-related project. Had Cain been using it to conduct his own science experiments with blood? Beth fought hurt and confusion as she and Ian crept up to the building. Ian couldn't possibly think she'd lied or kept the truth from him. But what if he was right? What if the man had confessed he was her father? The shock of learning her own parent was a killer could have been enough for her to block out his face and repress details of the abduction. She searched her mind again, but all she remembered was the Bible verses and prayers and preaching. Nothing about being related to the man who'd killed Sonny. She needed answers. Abram Cain might have them. Were he and Milo here? An eerie quiet hovered over the property. Did Cain have surveillance cameras? Would he see them approaching? Ready? Ian mouthed. She nodded. Ian pointed toward the right to a cluster of bushes and the door to the underground lab. Beth followed his lead and provided backup as he eased open the door, and they inched down the steps. It took a moment to adjust to the dark. It was cold, clammy. They heard a voice from somewhere deep in the place. Chills cascaded down Beth's neck. Vanessa, crying, begging for her life. Ian paused, listening as well. His gaze met hers, and she gestured to go ahead. She followed, each second that passed torturous. By the time they reached the end of the hallway, Beth could hardly breathe. Memories of being trapped in the cave threatened to immobilize her. She didn't realize Ian had gone so far ahead, until someone grabbed her from behind and shoved a knife to her neck. Ian froze. Footsteps behind him, then Beth's low gasp boomeranged off the walls. Shit. He'd moved too quickly, left her behind. Kane or his son had her. It was Ian's fault. He spun around, aiming his gun at the place he thought they'd be, but they were gone. Ian took off at a dead run. He nearly passed the corridor to the right, but Beth was dragging her feet, making noise. The direction of the sound launched him forward. He reached the end of the corridor and peered to the left, then the right. Dear God! He could hardly believe his eyes. Vanessa was tied to a metal gurney with her arms extended over a plastic tarp, meant to catch excess blood. Kane hadn't bothered to gag her. He must have thought no one would hear her cries for help. A low voice bellowed below Vanessa's screams, Beth pleading for the man to listen to her as he shoved her down beside Vanessa. Jesus God! The sick fuck was going to make her watch, just as he'd forced Beth to witness him slay Sonny. Ian remained immobile, assessing the situation. He needed to take the man off guard. Milo was kneeling beside Vanessa, his hand holding hers as if to comfort her. Abram Kane pressed a hand on top of Beth's head. I shouldn't have let you go. I should have ended it like Father said. What are you talking about? Beth said, her voice much calmer than Ian would have expected.
You were to be my first, Abram said. I messed up with Kelly. I slit her wrist to drain the bad blood from her, but then I panicked and wrote that suicide note. I should have buried her with the ones Father saved.
You killed Kelly Cousins? Beth asked. He nodded, eyes wild.
She was a sinner. She threw herself at the coach like some two-bit whore.
Then you came after me and Sonny, Beth said. Why?
Father killed your mother because she enticed him into sin. She gave you away thinking she was protecting you, but he tracked you down. He watched you for years, hoping you wouldn't become one of the whores. But he saw the way Otter looked at you and figured you were already lost.
He knew what was going on in the Otter house? Beth said.
Yes. He watched to see what you would do. Then you ran. His voice cracked. Father was proud that you resisted, and when you got in the truck with us, I thought we might bond. I finally had a sister.
Beth's face turned ashen. Ian moved closer. Abram truly believed what he was saying, which made him even more dangerous. You watched him kill other girls and did nothing, Beth said in a steely voice.
It is our calling, Abram said. We must save the sinners.
A hysterical laugh followed.
I wanted to add to our legacy by studying blood and finding a cure for the evil.
Prissy wasn't evil, and neither is Vanessa. Beth's labored breathing rattled in the air. Let her go like you let me go.
That was a mistake. You came back to hunt me, and now my son. It has to end.
Ian gripped his weapon as the shiny metal of Abram's knife glinted in the dark. It was going to end all right, but Vanessa and Beth wouldn't be the ones to die. The idea that she might be related to this man sickened Beth and spiked her anger. He'd stolen so much from her already. She wouldn't let him take anything else. She had to save Vanessa. Maybe the boy could be redeemed after all, and she could save 2 lives. Did your son help you murder Prissy? She asked. Abram tightened his grip around her neck. The knife pricked her skin. Blood seeped down her throat.
He has his own ways of saving souls, but he's being indoctrinated tonight. Vanessa will be his first. Of course, I must baptize her before the bloodletting.
Why did you bury the girls in the holler? Beth asked.
Because my grandfather, our grandfather, is buried at the top of the hill, he murmured against her ear. I wanted him to watch over them.
He was crazy. A shadow moved in the corner. Ian. She didn't hesitate. She jabbed her elbow in the man's side, then stomped on his foot, spun around and grabbed the knife. He grunted in pain, but he was strong and they fought for the knife. Dad! Milo vaulted toward them. His voice distracted Abram just long enough for her to knock the knife from the man's hand. Rage flared in his eyes and he lunged toward her, his hands bared as he closed them around her neck. A gunshot blasted the air. Beth tried to catch her breath, but he dragged her down with him. Blood soaked her chest as she collapsed onto the floor. Chapter 38. Ian's heart stopped. Beth was down and bleeding. Kane was on top of her. "Get him off me!" Beth shouted. Her voice jerked Ian from his shock. Vanessa was screaming, and Milo was running for his father, shouting "Dad" over and over again. Afraid Milo was armed, Ian frisked him, then handcuffed him to a metal pipe. By the time he reached Beth, she'd rolled Kane to the ground and pushed to her feet. Blood soaked her blouse. "Beth, I'm not hit. It's Kane's blood." "Thank God." "Help! Get me loose!" Vanessa cried. Beth ran to her and untied her while Ian knelt to check Kane's pulse. He was alive. The sound of Vanessa's sobs bounced off the walls as he called for an ambulance. The next few hours were chaos as the paramedics arrived to examine Vanessa and transport Abram to the hospital. The bullet had pierced his abdomen, but the man should live. Ian hoped he did. He wanted Abram to spend years suffering in prison for what he'd done. The CSU arrived along with Director Vance to process the lab. They found a collection of the victim's blood vials neatly labeled and alphabetized. Another room held paintings that he'd done using the girl's blood. Although he had sent some of the paintings to a few victims' families, he obviously hadn't known where other victims' parents lived, because they were runaways living on the streets. "Abram's father is dead," Director Vance told them. "Peyton found a reference to his death in the obituaries." "I know, he told me," Beth said. Director Vance gave Beth a sympathetic look. "The young girl they found who'd been dead 30 years was your mother, Beth." "Abram's father, my father, killed her," Beth said in a raspy voice. "Apparently my mother gave me away to protect me from him. I guess she loved me after all." The medics loaded a nearly unconscious Abram Kane onto a stretcher and started toward the ambulance. "Please let me talk to him," Milo said. Ian didn't know what to make of the kid yet. He was scary weird. He escorted Milo over to his father, but stayed close enough to listen. "Dad," Milo murmured. "I'm sorry." Abram Kane had the nerve to smile. Then he lowered his voice to a whisper. "I know you won't let me down, son." The sinister look Milo and his father exchanged made Ian's blood turn to ice. Beth spent the next week overseeing the indictment of Abram Kane for multiple homicides. Reverend Benton also faced charges of abuse and child endangerment, and Beth was trying to make charges of accomplice to murder fit. Apparently, Abram and Benton were cousins. Benton had known what Kane was doing all along. The family believed they were destined to save young women from the streets, each in their own way. It had started generations ago. Some of the bones she'd felt in that cave belonged to her great-grandfather's victims. The feds and Ian's deputies continued to search for other victims and another burial spot. So far, Abram refused to tell them anything. Beth had initiated comparing Milo's DNA to the remains from the boneyard to determine if his mother was among the victims. Abram admitted that he and his father were the ones Vinnie Barlow had seen at the rest stop when they dumped JJ in the bushes. When the trucker had found her so quickly and spotted them, they'd pretended to be passers-by and had called 911. Beth rubbed her forehead where another headache pulsed. She couldn't believe she shared the same blood as these men. Or that Ian had doubted her, had thought for a second that she would have protected them. She packed the last of her clothes to drive back to Knoxville. She needed time to forgive herself for repressing memories that could have saved a dozen lives. Agent Hamrick's wife, Josie Duquesne, who'd written stories of the other serial murders in Graveyard Falls, had reached out to her. Beth was giving Josie the exclusive story with the inside scoop. Michaels was furious, but his story on the church corruption had earned him enough attention to temporarily placate him. Ian had called her multiple times. He'd left messages saying that the Reverend's wife had spilled her guts about the mistreatment of the women in the church. He was doing everything in his power to get his mother away from the cult and her husband, who also faced charges of child endangerment because he'd presided over many of the exorcisms. Agent Coulter's wife, Mona, a counselor, had volunteered to work with Ian's mother and the other women in the church to help them heal and rebuild their lives. Graveyard Falls could finally go back to normal again, as if it had ever been normal.
At least Vanessa was home safe, and her grandmother Coco was recovering. Beth stroked the penny on the chain around her neck. She'd found a beautiful cemetery called Memorial Gardens, and had given Sonny a proper burial. When she'd placed the jar of pennies inside the casket, the sunshine had popped through the clouds. She had a feeling it was Sonny smiling down at her from heaven. Beth shoved her suitcase into the back of her car. She'd come to Graveyard Falls to find Sonny's killer, and she'd achieved that. Too bad she'd fallen in love with Ian. Her family had destroyed his. How could he ever forgive her for that? Beth was leaving town today. Ian wanted her to stay, but he had no right to ask. She'd insisted on following Abram Cain to prison and interrogating him herself. There were holes that needed to be filled in, questions about the time lapse between her mother's death and the recent victims buried in the holler, answers about how many others Abram's father had killed and where their bodies were. They might never know. The bones Beth had felt on the cave floor belonged to some of them. Now Ian held his mother's arm as they entered the hospital. His father was in a coma, but hopefully hearing her voice would bring him out of it. At least he'd made progress. The doctors had weaned his father off the ventilator, which was a good sign. He was breathing on his own. "I did this to him," his mother said, her voice breaking. "No, Mom, you didn't," Ian said. "Sheriff Heedler dropped the ball by not investigating properly. But Dad is free now, and his name is clear. Hopefully he can have some kind of future when he wakes up." He squeezed her arm. "Maybe you can too." She nodded weakly, her eyes downcast. A low moan rumbled from the bed, and Ian jerked his head toward his father. He was awake and looking at them. "I must be in heaven," his father said. "You're both here." His mother burst into tears, rushed toward his father, and stopped by the bed. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you, that I deserted you." His father looked up at him with tears in his eyes. "Thank you, son, for finding the truth." Ian's gut pinched. "I always believed in you, Dad." His father reached out his hand to his mother. Emotion swelled in Ian's throat as they hugged. Maybe the two of them would reconcile, and then he'd have his family back again. But what about Beth? He wanted her in his life. But what would his family think? There were old hurts, maybe bitterness between his father and Beth. "Dad, about Beth. I mean JJ. She shot you." "I brought that on myself." His father's voice cracked. "I was desperate and out of control. I was wrong to pull that knife. Please tell her I'm sorry." Ian squeezed his father's hand. "I have to talk to her, Dad." His father nodded. Then Ian left the room. If his father could forgive his mother and Beth, maybe Beth could forgive him. Beth thought being alone would help her heal, had thought locking up Sonny's killer would make the nightmares go away. But she was lonelier than ever, because she'd tasted what it was like to be loved. Worse, she'd learned that she'd been bred by a serial killer, that her brother was also a murderer. Who knew if her nephew could be saved? Director Vance had ordered her to take a leave of absence to heal. This time she'd agreed. She dressed in her running clothes, keeping alert as always as she rode the elevator down to the lobby and scanned the building. Old habits died hard. Knoxville was teeming with life, with city noises and traffic and people, so different from the small town of Graveyard Falls. At least here she was anonymous. Did she still want to be anonymous? To have no one to answer to or come home to at night? No one to love her or hold her or whisper sweet nothings in the dark? Don't be foolish. Ian didn't love you. If he had, he wouldn't have let you go. Traffic buzzed by as she clipped her phone to her belt and adjusted her earbuds to listen to her music. A few early morning joggers were already out, people heading to work. She turned to run her usual route toward the river. It felt good to be outside again, to breathe fresh air, to know that Sonny could rest in peace. As she'd done a dozen times this past week, she reviewed her conversations with Abram Cain in her head. She'd spent hours interrogating him, probing for answers about the victims and his father. Her father.
His name was Carl. Such a normal name for such a twisted killer. She'd also been starved for more information about her mother. Her name was Mary. She'd grown up in Kentucky but had a rough home life and had run away. Carl met Mary at a truck stop coffee shop. Mary had been young and vulnerable and had thought traveling with him across the country would be exciting. The fun had ended when she became pregnant. Carl's father did not approve. Beth jogged past the park, but suddenly the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Instincts alert, she glanced over her shoulder but didn't see anyone. A brittle laugh escaped her. Maybe she would never stop looking for trouble. It was a hazard of her job. Her job. God. Did she want to go back? With every case, she was inundated with the vile ugliness of some humans, just as with her own birth father. Each generation of the ones who believed in the calling had developed his own M.O., adding to the legacy. Abram had been infatuated with blood and paintings and decided the family should have something of their daughter's to keep. Milo's generation was obsessed with video games and technology, so he'd developed Deathscape. If Milo wasn't healed, what would the next generation think of? No. He had to be saved. She'd been in touch with counselors who'd gotten him placed in a residential mental health therapy program. The wind whistled around her as she jogged by the river. Unease pricked at her again. Irritated, she spun around, braced to fight. Ian nearly ran into her. She gaped at him in shock. Was there a problem with the arrest? He gently gripped her arms. Beth? She searched his face. What are you doing here? Trying to catch up with you. He was breathing hard, but the wind ruffled his hair and made him look sexier than ever. Or maybe she just missed him that much. She'd never imagined how much love could hurt. A heartbeat stretched into a full minute, the past a bleakness that hung between them. There had been lies and pain and nightmares and so many deaths. She didn't want to focus on death anymore. But panic tapped at her nerve endings. Is something wrong? Did Abram escape? His gaze locked with hers, the bitterness in his eyes when she'd first seen him at the task force gone. No, he's locked away tight. I just had to see you. Hope warred with worry. They had things to settle. Ian, I had no idea about my father. He cupped her face between his hands, making her heart stutter. I know. I never thought you did. I was just upset that day. I don't know why I reacted like that. We were both afraid for Vanessa, Beth said. And I was terrified for you, Ian admitted. The air between them became charged. People rushed by and traffic noises surrounded them, but Beth felt like they were in their own cocoon. I love you, Ian said gruffly. I love you and I miss you, and I want you in my life. Beth's heart soared with a happiness she'd never known. Did she really deserve this? Love? Ian dropped to his knees in front of her and dug something from his pocket. Her eyes widened at the sight of the velvet box. Ian? His mouth tugged into a smile, but his hand was trembling as he opened the box. A heart-shaped diamond glittered back. I've never given my heart to anyone, Beth. I'm giving it to you. He took her hand in his. His skin felt warm, calloused but soft at the same time. Will you marry me? Shock made her voice quiver. You want to marry me? After all that's happened? She bit her lip. After my family destroyed yours? After I shot your father? His chuckle rumbled deep and full of affection. Yeah, after all that. She couldn't believe it. I told you, I'm damaged, Ian. Evil runs in my blood. Evil is not in your blood, Ian said firmly. You fight evil every day. That means you have a good heart. He pulled her to him and slipped off the band, holding her hair into a ponytail, freeing her hair. Gently he ran his fingers through it. Freeing the strand seemed to free her reservations as well. His fingers, his smile, the gleam of desire in his eyes warmed Beth inside. I'm so damned proud of you, he said gruffly. And I'm so in love with you that I can't sleep at night. I'm in love with you too. Beth blinked back tears as she pressed her hand over her chest.
This heart has belonged to you since I was 15.
A tender smile flickered in Ian's eyes, need and hunger mingling. I love you, Beth. I've missed you.
I missed you too.
He squeezed her hand. So are you going to answer me? Will you be my wife? A tear seeped from her eye as she whispered yes. Ian slid the ring on her finger, then cupped her face between his hands and kissed her with all the love in his heart. Beth poured herself into the kiss. The bleakness she'd felt for years faded away, as love and hope budded in her heart. She'd never settled anywhere, never had a real home. The sun beamed down on her, sparkling off a shiny penny on the ground, and Sonny's whisper of approval tickled her ear. Sonny wanted Beth to fulfill her dreams for the both of them. And she would. She was going to make a family with Ian. We hope you have enjoyed our presentation of All the Dead Girls by Rita Herron, performed by Eric G. Dove. Performance copyright 2016 by Brilliance Audio. All rights reserved. For further information concerning this program or other Brilliance Audio titles, please call the following toll-free number, 1-800-222-3225, or visit our website at www.brillianceaudio.com. No part of this recording may be played for an audience or reproduced in any form. It may not be streamed, downloaded, broadcast, or copied without written permission. Address all inquiries to Brilliance Audio, P.O. Box 887, Grand Haven, Michigan 49417.